My son brought his new girlfriend to dinner. She seemed flawless, smiling politely while admiring the crown molding of my dining room. But as we were eating, he reached under the heavy mahogany table and squeezed my hand 3 times. It was an old signal between us, a secret code we established decades ago. That simple, desperate gesture made me realize a shocking truth about our family that I never saw coming. I thought he was begging me to save him from a monster. I did not know the monster was already inside the house. My name is Augustus Wright. I am 69 years old, and I built a real estate empire with nothing but grit, sweat, and a promise to my late wife. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect everything you built from a threat hiding in plain sight. The atmosphere in my formal dining room was suffocating. Across from me sat Meredith, my son Kendrick's new girlfriend. She was 30, white, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit and wore a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She spent the first course looking around my home like an appraiser, calculating the square footage rather than a guest enjoying a meal. She took a delicate sip of her wine and placed the crystal glass down. "You know, Augustus?" she began, her voice dripping with that specific polished condescension I had dealt with my entire career. "It is truly remarkable what you have accomplished. It is always so inspiring to see someone of your background overcome the odds. Your home is incredibly articulate, just like you. I am simply amazed at how well you have done for yourself." Every word was a calculated insult, a subtle reminder of the racial lines she clearly believed still defined us. I felt the familiar heat of anger flare in my chest, the same rage I used to conquer boardrooms. But I swallowed it. I smiled my calm practice smile. I nodded and cut my steak. I endured her quiet racism because I loved my son, and I wanted to give this woman a fair chance for his sake. But Kendrick was not eating. He sat stiffly beside her, his shoulders rigid, his eyes darting nervously between his plate and the front door. Suddenly I felt a cold, trembling hand brush against my knee under the table. It was Kendrick. His fingers found my palm, and he squeezed. 1, 2, 3. 3 rapid, desperate squeezes. My heart stopped. The world around me seemed to freeze. The clinking of silverware and Meredith's endless, arrogant chatter faded into a dull hum. 3 squeezes. It was a signal we had not used in over 25 years. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. Kendrick was 10 years old. We were at a crowded summer festival, and a group of older, vicious boys had cornered him near the grandstand. He was terrified, tears streaming down his face, completely paralyzed by fear. I had walked up right behind him. He reached back, grabbed my hand, and squeezed exactly 3 times. It was the code my late wife Loretta and I had taught him. It meant, "Dad, save me. I am in trouble." I stepped in front of him that day, standing between my boy and the world, and I made sure those bullies never looked in his direction again. Loretta and I had promised each other we would always be his shield. Now, 25 years later, a grown man of 35, he was using it again. I looked at my son across the candlelight. His face was a mask of sheer terror. He was sweating slightly, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. He looked like that 10-year-old boy again, trapped and begging his father for rescue. My internal world exploded. The fatherly instinct, fierce and primal, ignited every nerve in my body. Who was threatening him? Was it the mob? Was it a loan shark? Or was it the woman sitting right next to him? Meredith continued talking, completely oblivious to the silent, desperate conversation happening inches away from her. She went on about her high-end lifestyle and her connections, her voice grating on my nerves. I realized then that she was not just a snobbish, entitled woman. She was a threat. My son was being held hostage in his own life, and she was the warden. The polite, wealthy old man facade I was wearing melted away instantly. The ruthless street fighter who clawed his way out of the slums woke up. I had to get Kendrick out of this. I had to know what kind of danger had followed him into my home. I wiped my mouth methodically with my linen napkin and set it gently beside my plate. "This meal calls for something truly special," I said, keeping my voice deep, smooth, and perfectly even. "I have a vintage bottle of Cabernet in the cellar that I have been saving for a momentous occasion. Excuse me for just a moment, I will be right back." Meredith clapped her hands together lightly, her fake smile widening. "Oh, that sounds absolutely delightful, Augustus. We will be right here." I stood up, gave Kendrick a brief, reassuring look that I hoped conveyed I understood his silent plea, and walked out of the dining room. But I did not go down the hall toward the wine cellar. My footsteps made no sound on the thick Persian rug as I turned sharply into the front foyer. Meredith had left her designer leather handbag resting on the console table by the entrance. I am not a man who violates privacy lightly. I have built my reputation on honor and hard boundaries, but honor takes a back seat when my blood is in danger. My son was screaming for help in silence, and I was going to find out why. I stepped up to the table. The house was quiet save for the faint murmur of Meredith's voice echoing from the dining room. I unclasped the gold latch of her heavy leather bag. The interior was lined in red silk. I expected to find the usual things: a compact mirror, expensive lipstick, perhaps a threatening letter from whoever was squeezing my son for money. I pushed aside a leather wallet and a set of keys, digging deeper into the main compartment. My fingers brushed against a thick folded stack of heavy parchment paper. I pulled it out into the dim light of the foyer. It was not a letter from a loan shark. It was a legal document. I flipped open the first page, and the bold black letters at the top made the blood freeze in my veins. Durable power of attorney and transfer of assets. I scanned the paragraphs rapidly. It was a complete legal surrender of the Augustus Wright Trust, transferring total control of my entire real estate empire, my bank accounts, and my home. But that was not the worst part. Attached to the back was a blank medical assessment form declaring me mentally incompetent, suffering from advanced rapid-onset dementia. My hand shook. I reached back into the bottom of the designer bag, feeling for a pen or a seal. Instead, my fingers wrapped around something hard, cold, and cylindrical. I pulled it out. It was a medical-grade syringe, fully capped, loaded to the brim with a clear, unidentified liquid. They did not come to my house for dinner. They came to destroy my mind and steal my life. I shoved the documents and the syringe back into the silk lining of her bag, snapping the gold clasp shut with a soft, decisive click. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to slow down. 40 years in the cutthroat real estate business taught me one vital lesson: never let your enemy know you see the blade in their hand. I took a deep breath, smoothing the lapels of my jacket, and walked toward the wine cellar. I bypassed the vintage Cabernet and grabbed a dusty bottle of cheap Pinot Noir. I needed to play the part they had written for me. When I stepped back into the dining room, I let my shoulders slump just a fraction. I allowed a slight, noticeable tremor to enter my hands as I approached the table. I fumbled with the corkscrew, pretending to struggle with the simple mechanism. Meredith watched me with hawk-like precision, her eyes calculating and cold. I poured the wine, letting a few drops spill onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Oh, clumsiness is catching up with me," I muttered with a weak, apologetic chuckle. Meredith's smile widened, transforming from polite to predatory. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table, looking at the spilled wine as if it were a personal victory. "Oh, do not worry about it, Augustus," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "We all have our clumsy moments as we get older. Tell me, how has your memory been lately? I read a fascinating article about cognitive decline in seniors. It can sneak up on you without warning." I gave a bewildered, slightly vacant look, a performance worthy of a seasoned actor. My memory, "Oh, it is fine, I suppose. I misplace my keys now and then. Nothing serious." I noticed Kendrick shifting uncomfortably in his chair. He looked down at his plate, refusing to meet my eye. "Dad, you forgot my birthday last month?" Kendrick interjected, his voice trembling perfectly. He sounded exactly like a concerned, loving son. "You called me 2 days late. I have been telling you to see Dr. Evans for a checkup." The betrayal hit me harder than the sight of the syringe. Kendrick was feeding her narrative. My own flesh and blood was paving the way for my institutionalization. I did not forget his birthday. I had bought him a vintage watch and handed it to him over breakfast on the exact day. But I swallowed the truth, offering a confused, helpless nod. "Did I am sorry, son. Time just slips away these days." Meredith's eyes gleamed with raw greed. She began looking around the dining room again, her gaze sweeping over the crystal chandelier, the original oil paintings, and the imported hardwood floors. "This property is truly magnificent, Augustus," she said, her tone casually dismissive yet appraising. "The market value in this specific neighborhood has skyrocketed. Maintaining a place this massive must be a terrible burden for a man living alone, especially with your slipping memory. Have you ever considered downsizing, maybe transitioning into an assisted living facility? It would take so much stress off your shoulders." "And Kendrick chimed in right on cue. "It is true, Dad. We worry about you being here all by yourself. What if you leave the stove on? What if you fall on those marble stairs? We just want you to be safe." I looked between the two of them. They were a perfectly rehearsed team. She was the driving force, the architect of this nightmare, and my son was her willing pawn, twisting the knife of false concern. They were burying me alive right here at my own dining table under the guise of love and safety. I gave them exactly what they wanted. A fragile, tired sigh. "Maybe you are right," I whispered, staring blankly at my plate. "Maybe it is getting to be too much for me." The rest of the dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare, with Meredith subtly inventorying my assets while Kendrick played the dutiful, worried heir. The agonizing evening finally came to an end. I walked them to the front door, my steps intentionally slow and shuffling. Meredith gave me a stiff, lingering hug that smelled of expensive perfume and deceit. "Take care of yourself, Augustus," she whispered near my ear, her tone laced with a chilling finality. "We will be checking in on you very soon." Kendrick hugged me next. It was a weak, cowardly embrace. I waited for another squeeze, another hidden plea for help. Nothing came. His hands were limp, his eyes focused on the floor. "I will call you tomorrow, Dad," he mumbled quickly, stepping out into the cool night air. I stood on the porch and waved as they got into Meredith's sleek black sedan. I kept the vacant, friendly smile plastered on my face until their taillights disappeared around the corner of the gated community. The moment they were out of sight, the frail old man vanished. My posture straightened, my jaw locked, and the fire in my blood flared to life. I stepped back inside and slammed the heavy oak door shut, engaging the deadbolt, the chain lock, and the electronic security system. The house plunged into a fortress-like silence. I did not waste a single second. I sprinted down the hallway toward my private study at the back of the house. I locked that door too. I dropped into my leather desk chair and fired up my encrypted computer. My mind raced through 1,000 terrifying scenarios. If they had a syringe and a transfer of assets document ready, they were already moving. They were not just planning for the future. They were executing their plan right now. I needed to see exactly how much damage had already been done. I bypassed my standard banking portals and logged directly into the secure offshore server where I kept my emergency liquid assets. This was a fail-safe account, a ghost fund designed for extreme catastrophes. Only 2 people in the world knew it existed: me and my son Kendrick. I had given him emergency access years ago just in case something ever happened to me. The encrypted dashboard loaded, casting a harsh blue light across my face. I navigated to the ghost account, my pulse hammering against my eardrums. I expected to see the solid, comforting numbers I had meticulously maintained. Instead, the screen displayed a glaring, catastrophic discrepancy. My chest tightened. I clicked on the recent transaction history. My breath caught in my throat. $50,000 had been wired out of the account. I checked the timestamp on the transaction. It had been executed exactly 2 hours ago, right as we were sitting down for dinner, right as Kendrick was squeezing my hand under the table, begging for my help. The transfer was authorized using a certified electronic signature. My signature. A signature I had not authorized. My son had not been squeezing my hand to ask for rescue. He was squeezing my hand while his girlfriend remotely drained my emergency funds. The distress signal was nothing more than a sick, calculated misdirection. The theft was already underway, and the son I swore to protect was the one holding the gun to my head. I did not call the police. In my world, involving the authorities before you have the full picture is a fatal mistake. Instead, I picked up my secure line and dialed the only man I trusted implicitly. Vincent Hayes had been my personal attorney and closest confidant for over 30 years. We had fought brutal legal wars together to build this empire. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert despite the late hour. I told him exactly what I had found. $50,000 was gone from the ghost account, siphoned out right under my nose while I was eating steak in my own dining room. "I need you to trace that wire transfer right now, Vincent." I demanded, my tone leaving no room for debate. "Find out exactly where that money went and what authorization they used to bypass the bank's secondary security protocols." Vincent did not waste time with questions. He immediately logged into his encrypted terminal. For the next hour, the only sound in my study was the frantic clicking of my own keyboard as I initiated lockdown procedures on my other vulnerable accounts, waiting for Vincent to follow the digital blood trail. The digital clock on my desk flashed 1 in the morning when my secure line buzzed again. I snatched the receiver. "Tell me you have it," I said. "I have it." Augustus Vincent replied, but his voice was unusually grim. It is worse than a simple hack or a stolen password. The transfer was executed legally, at least on paper. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Explain that to me, Vincent. How does someone legally steal $50,000 from a blind trust? They did not use a password, Augustus. They used a medical power of attorney. Vincent paused, the silence hanging heavy over the line. A medical power of attorney specifically triggered by a physician declaration of your mental incompetence. They filed a certified medical document claiming you are suffering from rapid onset dementia and are no longer fit to manage your own financial affairs. The document grants Kendrick full conservatorship over your emergency assets. The room spun for a fraction of a second. The blank medical assessment form I had seen in Meredith's handbag earlier that evening suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. They had not just drafted it. They had already executed a version of it. Who signed the medical declaration? I demanded, my voice dangerously low. Vincent typed rapidly on his end. A Dr. Eris Thorne, private practice downtown. The signature was authenticated yesterday morning. A tidal wave of realization crashed over me. Meredith was not just an opportunistic gold digger. She was a highly organized, dangerous predator. She had doctors on her payroll. She knew how to navigate complex trust law. And she had her claws buried deep into my son. The three squeezes under the table flashed in my mind again. Kendrick was not complicit in this. He was a hostage. Meredith must have found out about the ghost account, backed him into a corner, and forced him to facilitate the transfer. If she was bold enough to forge medical documents and steal $50,000 right out of the gate, what else was she capable of? She had a syringe in her purse. She was planning to poison me, incapacitate me, or worse, and she was forcing my boy to watch. I had to act carefully. If I spooked her, Kendrick would be the one to pay the price. Lock down every other account Vincent I ordered. Everything. Put a freeze on the main trust. But leave the ghost account open. Let her think she still has access. We need her to feel confident until I figure out how to extract my son from her grip. I hung up the phone and leaned back in the heavy leather chair. The image of Loretta, my late wife, stared back at me from a silver frame on the desk. I promised her I would protect our boy. I had built a fortress of wealth to shield him from the harsh realities of this world, but I had failed to protect him from the snakes that slithered inside the gates. I would not fail him now. Whatever Meredith was threatening him with, I would dismantle it piece by piece. I would tear her operation to the ground and bury her under the rubble. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, my cell phone shattered the dead silence of the study. The caller ID glowed brightly in the dark room. Kendrick. I answered immediately, pressing the phone tight against my ear. Kendrick, are you all right? I asked, my voice laced with genuine paternal concern. Dad. Kendrick's voice was a jagged, hysterical sob. Dad, you have to help me, please, you have to help me. He was hyperventilating, his breaths coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Slow down, son. Talk to me. Where are you? What is happening? It is Meredith, Dad. She is not who you think she is. Kendrick wept, his voice cracking with pure terror. She is a monster. She has people, dangerous people. I owe them money, Dad, a lot of money. I did not know how bad it was until it was too late. They are forcing me to do this. The transfer tonight, that was her. She made me do it. I kept my voice incredibly calm, playing the role of the terrified but steady father. What do they want, Kendrick? Tell me what they want, and I will fix it. They want the South Side Commercial District. He sobbed, the panic in his voice escalating. She has the transfer deeds ready. She says if you do not sign the commercial district over to me by tomorrow morning, her people are going to kill me. Dad, they are going to kill me. They have guns. You have to sign it, Dad. Please, just sign the buildings over so I can pay them off and get away from her. I am so sorry I brought this to your door. I am so sorry. I closed my eyes, absorbing the sheer desperation in my son's voice. The Southside Commercial District was the crown jewel of my real estate portfolio. It was worth tens of millions. It was the legacy I had intended to leave him. Handing it over under duress was madness, but listening to my boy cry for his life was tearing my heart apart. I will do whatever it takes to keep you safe, son, I promised fiercely. Just tell me where to meet you. As Kendrick continued to weep into the receiver, something caught my attention. A faint, rhythmic rustling in the background. As a man who routinely dealt with corporate espionage, my home office was equipped with a state-of-the-art digital audio console. I quickly routed the live call through my computer sound isolation software. I engaged the active noise cancellation and cranked up the vocal enhancement frequencies to isolate the background audio behind Kendrick's voice. The digital waveform on my monitor spiked. I put on my studio-grade headphones and listened closely. Behind the sound of my son's hysterical, pathetic sobbing, the background noise crystallized into absolute clarity. It was Meredith. She was not holding a gun to his head. She was standing right next to him. "Cry louder," her voice whispered, sharp, calm, and utterly devoid of threat. "Make the old man scared. Put some real panic into it, Kendrick. We almost have him." My blood turned to absolute ice. The crushing realization paralyzed me in my chair. I was not dealing with a gold digger holding my son hostage. I was dealing with my own flesh and blood. Kendrick and Meredith were partners. The entire distress signal was a calculated theatrical performance designed to exploit a father's love. The digital audio file played on a continuous loop in my headphones, but I only needed to hear it once. My own son. The boy I had protected from every shadow in the world was the one orchestrating my demise. He was not a hostage trembling in the grip of a ruthless cartel. He was a predator weaponizing a father's unconditional love to steal an empire. The 3 squeezes under the dinner table were not a desperate plea for rescue. They were a psychological dagger expertly twisted into the softest part of my heart. I sat frozen in my leather chair, staring blankly at the glowing waveform on my computer monitor. A cold, suffocating numbness spread through my chest, extinguishing the frantic protective fire that had consumed me just moments ago. The boy I raised was dead. In his place stood a stranger willing to drug his father, forge medical records, and fake a hostage situation to bypass probate. Meredith was just the hired muscle, the white facade he used to make the threat believable. Kendrick was the mastermind. The silence in my study was absolute, mirroring the sudden, profound death of my paternal hope. My chest hollowed out, leaving nothing but a vast, freezing void. Memories of Loretta flooded my mind, unbidden and sharp. I remembered the sterile smell of her hospital room 10 years ago, the rhythmic, agonizing beep of her heart monitor. I had held her frail hand, the skin paper thin and cool to the touch. "Protect our boy Augustus," she had whispered, her voice barely a breath against the steady hum of the machines. "Do not let this harsh world harden him. Make sure he never has to fight the wars we fought." I had kissed her forehead and sworn an oath to God and to her that Kendrick would always be safe. I had spent the last decade fulfilling that promise with every ounce of my strength. I built walls of wealth and privilege around him. I funded his failed business ventures without question, bought his luxury cars, and cleared away every obstacle in his path before he even knew they were there. I gave him a life completely devoid of consequence, a life of absolute ease. And in doing so, I had created a monster. I had shielded him from the harsh realities of the world, only to watch him become the very thing I tried to protect him from. An entitled, ruthless predator willing to devour his own blood for a bigger piece of the pie. I reached up and wiped a single hot tear from my cheek. It would be the last tear I ever shed for Kendrick Wright. I took a deep, shuddering breath and visualized a heavy iron vault closing around my heart, the heavy steel tumblers sliding into place with a resounding, permanent click. The grieving, desperate father was locked inside, buried alive. The man who remained sitting at the mahogany desk was Augustus Wright, the ruthless street fighter who had clawed his way out of the dirt to build a dynasty. If my son wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception, he was about to learn that I wrote the rule book and I owned the board. I leaned forward and pulled the phone microphone closer to my mouth. I injected my voice with a perfect blend of panic and capitulation. "Kendrick, I am here," I said, making my breathing sound erratic and shallow. "I will do it. I will sign the Southside Commercial District over to you right now. I cannot let them hurt you. Tell me where to bring the transfer deeds." There was a brief, muffled shuffle on the other end, followed by Kendrick's voice, thick with fake relief. "Oh, thank God, Dad." "Thank you. They are telling me to meet you at the old coffee shop on Elm Street. Just you. Bring the papers at 8 in the morning. They said if you call the police, they will kill me right there." "I will be there, son," I promised, infusing every ounce of faux desperation I could muster. "Hold on just a little longer." I hung up the phone. The performance was flawless. They thought they had won. They thought the old, wealthy, dementia-ridden fool was dancing exactly to their tune. I stood up from my desk and walked over to my personal safe. It was time to prepare the bait. I spent the next hour meticulously crafting a counterfeit set of transfer deeds. I used the official letterhead of my holding company, replicated the dense legal jargon perfectly, and signed the bottom with a deliberately shaky, fragile hand to match their narrative of my rapid cognitive decline. To the untrained eye or an eager, greedy son blinded by his own ambition, it looked like the keys to the kingdom. But legally, it was nothing more than expensive scrap paper. Before leaving my study, I opened a hidden compartment in my desk drawer and retrieved a military-grade micro GPS tracker. It was smaller than a dime, equipped with a heavy-duty magnetic adhesive base. I slipped it into my coat pocket. The morning sun was just beginning to break over the city skyline when I arrived at the Elm Street coffee shop. The place was mostly empty, smelling of roasted beans and stale regret. Kendrick was sitting in a corner booth, hunched over a cup of black coffee. He looked suitably disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, playing the role of the terrified hostage to absolute perfection. I rushed over to him, sliding into the booth and gripping his shoulders with trembling hands. "Are you hurt?" I asked, scanning his face with wide, fearful eyes. He shook his head, his hands trembling as he reached for the thick manila envelope I placed on the table. "No, they let me go for the meeting. Are these the papers?" I nodded, playing the broken, defeated man. "Everything is signed, Kendrick. The Southside District is yours. Just give this to them and come home." He clutched the envelope to his chest, a flicker of genuine, unadulterated triumph flashing in his eyes before he masked it with a grateful sob. "Thank you, Dad. You saved my life. I have to go before they get suspicious." He stood up hastily. I stood up with him, pulling him into a tight, desperate embrace. As my arms wrapped around his shoulders, I dropped my right hand down toward his waist, my fingers palming the micro tracker. In one fluid, practiced motion, I pressed the adhesive backing firmly against the inner heel of his expensive Italian leather loafer. It stuck instantly, completely invisible. "Be careful, son," I whispered into his ear, letting my voice crack perfectly. He broke the hug, gave me one last terrified look, and hurried out of the coffee shop without looking back. I sat back down in the booth, ordering a black coffee from a passing waitress. I pulled out my secure smartphone and opened the tracking application. A small red dot blinked to life on the digital map, moving rapidly away from the cafe. I watched the screen with cold, detached precision. If Kendrick was truly being extorted by violent loan sharks, the dot would lead to a gritty warehouse, an abandoned lot, or a shady back alley in the dangerous part of town. Instead, I watched the red beacon travel smoothly down the interstate, bypassing the industrial zones entirely. The dot took the exit for the Silkwood District, the most affluent, exclusive neighborhood in the entire metropolitan area. I zoomed in on the map as the tracker finally came to a halt. Kendrick had not driven to a dangerous cartel hideout to hand over the deeds for his life. The GPS coordinates pinpointed his location perfectly. He was parked inside the private gated garage of an ultra-luxury penthouse high-rise, the exact kind of place a man would go to celebrate stealing his father's empire. I left the coffee shop and climbed into my inconspicuous sedan. The red dot on my screen remained stationary inside the Silkwood District high-rise. I drove across town, my face a mask of cold resolve. I arrived at the towering glass and steel structure within 20 minutes. The private underground garage was secured by heavy iron gates and a biometric scanner, a fortress meant to keep the public out. But they forgot who built the foundation of this city. As a major developer, my holding company owned the underlying property management firm that serviced half the luxury towers in this zip code. I pulled a sleek black master override card from my wallet, swiped it against the reader, and watched the iron gates slide open without a sound. I drove down into the subterranean levels, the cool fluorescent lights reflecting off rows of luxury vehicles. I tracked the GPS signal to the VIP sub-basement. There it was. Kendrick's bright red Italian sports car parked arrogantly across two premium spaces. The engine was still ticking, radiating heat. I parked my sedan 2 aisles over in the shadows and walked silently toward my son's vehicle. I approached the sleek red car. Kendrick always was careless. He relied on the building's security to protect his toys, never realizing that true power bypasses standard security. I took a small electronic key fob cloner from my coat pocket. It was a tool my security team used for asset recovery. I aimed it at the driver's side door, captured the residual signal, and clicked the button. The car unlocked with a soft double chirp. I popped the trunk and lifted the heavy carbon fiber lid. If Kendrick were truly the victim of a violent extortion ring, this trunk would hold desperate measures. Bags of bundled cash, threatening letters written in blood, or perhaps a weapon for self-defense. Instead, the trunk looked like the display window of a high-end boutique. I pushed aside a custom leather golf bag and found a stack of glossy shopping bags from the most expensive retailers in the world. I pulled out a handful of crisp receipts: $5,000 for a designer handbag, $10,000 for a bespoke tailored suit. A receipt from a private jeweler caught my eye. It was for a flawless 4-carat diamond engagement ring. The total cost was $85,000, paid in full, utilizing funds siphoned directly from my compromised accounts. I tossed the receipt aside, my disgust deepening with every second. Underneath the shopping bags lay a thick leather-bound folio embossed with the logo of a rival real estate firm. I flipped it open. It was a finalized purchase agreement for a sprawling beachfront mansion in a tropical tax haven. The buyers listed on the contract were Kendrick Wright and Meredith Vance. They were not planning to pay off loan sharks. They were funding a lavish early retirement built on the stolen ruins of my life's work. They had used the fabricated story of armed thugs to extort the Southside Commercial District from me, intending to liquidate it and vanish into a life of absolute luxury. My son had put a price tag on his father, and the proceeds were paying for a tropical vacation and a diamond ring. I dug deeper into the trunk, my hands moving with surgical precision. I was looking for the real weapon, the tool they planned to use to execute their final takeover. Beneath the spare tire compartment, I found a locked steel briefcase. The combination was easy to guess. Kendrick had used the same 4 digits for everything since high school. It was his mother's birthday. The sheer audacity of him using Loretta's sacred date to secure the instruments of my destruction made my vision blur with rage. I spun the dials, heard the mechanical click, and snapped the locks open. I lifted the heavy steel lid, bracing myself for whatever fresh betrayal lay inside. The interior of the briefcase was lined with dense foam. In the center lay a pristine manila folder. I pulled it out and opened it under the harsh garage lights. It was not a financial ledger. It was a clinical, step-by-step operational blueprint typed cleanly on crisp white paper. The heading read, Phase 3 Medical Transition. I scanned the bullet points, my blood running cold. It detailed a systematic schedule for poisoning me. It listed the exact dosages of a heavy, untraceable synthetic neurotoxin designed to rapidly mimic the symptoms of advanced Alzheimer's disease. The instructions were horrifyingly specific. Add 10 drops to his morning coffee. Increase dosage by 5 drops daily until severe disorientation is achieved. The next section outlined the logistics of my physical removal. It contained confirmed booking details for a private, highly restrictive psychiatric facility out of state, a place where wealthy families locked away their inconvenient elders. It noted the facility's strict no-visitor policy and authorized Kendrick as the sole point of contact. The final page was a checklist for the night they planned to extract me. It included instructions on how to use the syringe I had found in Meredith's purse to sedate me completely if I put up a fight. They were going to chemically fry my brain, drag me out of my own home in the dead of night, and lock me in a padded room until I forgot my own name. They had mapped out the total destruction of my mind and my dignity with the clinical detachment of a corporate merger. I stared at the blueprint, the sheer malice of it searing into my retinas. This was not just theft. This was premeditated psychological murder. They did not just want my empire. They wanted to erase the man who built it, turning me into a drooling, compliant ghost incapable of ever pointing a finger at them. I carefully folded the document, sliding it into the breast pocket of my coat. It was the ultimate piece of evidence. A sudden noise shattered the silence of the underground garage. The distinct echoing chime of the VIP elevator doors sliding open. I froze. High-heeled shoes clicked sharply against the concrete floor, accompanied by the heavy thud of men's dress shoes. They were laughing loudly. The victorious laughter of 2 people who believed they had just pulled off the heist of the century. I gently lowered the trunk lid, leaving it unlatched to avoid the loud mechanical click. I ducked down, instantly pressing my back against the cold side panel of the red sports car. The footsteps grew louder, moving directly down my aisle. Through the narrow gap between the sports car and a massive black SUV parked next to it, I saw them. Kendrick and Meredith. They were walking arm in arm, stopping to kiss passionately. Kendrick had a smug, triumphant grin on his face. He held the manila envelope I had given him at the coffee shop, waving it like a trophy. I was trapped in the tight space between the two vehicles, completely cornered. Meredith giggled, pulling Kendrick toward the rear of the car. "We need to put the deeds in the safe," she purred. "Open the trunk." I pressed my back against the cold metal of the sports car, my breath caught tight in my throat. Kendrick reached for the trunk latch. I had less than a second before he opened it and found the combination lock spun and the foam insert disturbed. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my own car keys. My sedan was parked 2 aisles over in the dense shadows of the garage. I pressed the red panic button. A deafening siren erupted through the concrete cavern, the horn blaring violently and echoing off the walls. Kendrick jumped back in shock, dropping the manila envelope on the ground. Meredith gasped, spinning around to look toward the source of the noise. "What the hell is that?" Kendrick shouted over the piercing alarm. He grabbed Meredith by the arm, pulling her away from the sports car and toward the elevator bank to seek safety. The moment their backs were turned, I slipped out from the narrow gap. I moved silently and swiftly, blending into the shadows of the concrete pillars until I reached the emergency stairwell. I pushed the heavy metal door open and stepped inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached into my breast pocket and felt the crisp paper of the medical blueprint. The document bore the signature of the man who had rubber-stamped my mental destruction. Dr. Eris Thorne. I had my next target. The morning sun was brutally bright as I pulled up to the upscale medical plaza in the financial district. Dr. Eris Thorne operated a boutique concierge clinic on the top floor, catering exclusively to the city elite. I did not bother making an appointment. I walked past the marble front desk, completely ignoring the protests of the startled receptionist. "Sir, you cannot go back there," she called out, picking up her phone to call security. I did not slow my pace. I reached the heavy frosted glass door bearing Thorne's name and kicked it open with the flat of my heavy boot. The door slammed against the interior wall with a sound like a gunshot. Dr. Thorne was sitting behind a massive teak desk, sipping coffee and reviewing a patient chart. He was a distinguished-looking man in his early 50s with silver hair and a tailored designer lab coat. He jumped to his feet, spilling hot coffee down his pristine shirt. "Who do you think you are?" he demanded, his face flushing with arrogant outrage. "I am calling the police right now." I walked slowly into the room, my presence filling the space. "I am Augustus Wright," I said, my voice echoing with a low, lethal resonance. "The man you diagnosed with rapid onset dementia yesterday morning without ever having the courtesy to look me in the eye." Thorne froze. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His hand hovered over his desk phone, trembling uncontrollably. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick black dossier. My attorney Vincent had worked through the night, utilizing every contact in his vast network to pull the thread on Dr. Thorne. I slammed the dossier onto the center of his desk, the heavy thud rattling his coffee cup. "Let us test your cognitive function today, doctor," I said, leaning over the desk so my face was inches from his. "Inside that folder are the records of 3 offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands under your wife's maiden name. There are also bank statements detailing exactly 42 wire transfers made by the families of wealthy seniors right before you declared those seniors legally incompetent. You have been running a highly lucrative side business selling fake medical diagnoses to greedy heirs, and you have not paid a single dime of federal income tax on those bribes." Thorne collapsed back into his ergonomic chair, his breathing shallow and rapid. He stared at the open folder, his eyes wide with absolute terror. "You have no proof of this," he stammered, though his voice lacked any conviction. "It is completely inadmissible. It does not need to be admissible in a courtroom to trigger a full IRS audit," I replied coldly. "I have already drafted the anonymous tip to the federal tax authorities and the state medical board. But I will not stop there. I own the commercial holding company that leases this building. I am your landlord. I will evict you by the end of the week. Then I will personally fund a class action lawsuit on behalf of every family you have destroyed. I will strip you of your medical license, drain your bank accounts, and ensure you spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary." The psychological warfare worked exactly as I intended. Thorne was not a hardened criminal. He was a coward in a white coat who had gotten far too comfortable playing God with the lives of the elderly. Faced with the absolute certainty of his own destruction, the arrogant physician completely crumbled. He buried his face in his hands, a pathetic sob escaping his lips. "Please," he begged, his voice muffled by his trembling fingers. "Please, Mr. Wright, I will lose everything. My practice, my family. You cannot do this to me." I can and I will, I stated, circling the desk and standing directly over him. Unless you start talking right now. I want to know exactly how the assessment was ordered. I want to know the exact timeline. Give me every detail of the transaction and I might consider letting you keep your freedom. Thorne looked up, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. He reached a shaking hand into his desk drawer and pulled out a locked ledger, frantically tossing it onto the desk. It was all him, Thorne cried out, pointing a trembling finger at the air. Your son, Kendrick. He came to me 2 months ago. He said you were losing your grip on reality and making terrible financial decisions that were going to bankrupt the family trust. He paid me $20,000 in cash to pre-sign the medical power of attorney. I stared at him, processing the timeline. 2 months ago. Kendrick had been planning this long before Meredith ever stepped foot in my dining room. I grabbed Thorne by the collar of his expensive lab coat and hauled him halfway out of his chair. And Meredith, I demanded, my grip tightening against his throat. How did she facilitate the fake medical records? Did she deliver the cash? Thorne choked, his eyes bulging as he struggled to breathe. He shook his head frantically. Meredith did not facilitate anything. She is not his girlfriend. I released his collar, letting him drop heavily back into his chair. What did you just say? I asked, my voice a deadly whisper. Thorne gasped for air, massaging his throat. Meredith Vance is not a girlfriend. He wheezed, his eyes darting away from mine in terror. She is a black market attorney. She was disbarred 5 years ago in New York for corporate embezzlement. She operates entirely in the shadows now. She specializes in hostile asset takeovers of the elderly. The room tilted slightly. The ground beneath my feet felt entirely unstable. Kendrick did not get trapped by a gold digger. Thorne continued delivering the final devastating blow to my fatherly heart. He sought her out. He hired her. He brought her in to structure the trust transfer and the medical conservatorship so it would be completely airtight against any legal challenges you tried to mount. I stared at the pathetic doctor, the sheer magnitude of my son malice finally taking complete shape. And what is her fee? I asked. Thorne swallowed hard, a drop of sweat rolling down his temple. Kendrick agreed to pay her 20% of your total estate the moment you are locked inside the psychiatric facility. I left Dr. Thorne trembling in his sterile office and drove back to my estate. The city blurred past my windows, a gray smear against the sharp, crystalline focus taking over my mind. My own son had not just fallen in with the wrong crowd or made a desperate, panicked mistake. He was the architect of my destruction. He had actively hunted down a disgraced black market attorney and paid her 20% of my legacy to build an airtight cage for me. The sheer theatricality of it all made my stomach churn with a profound, visceral disgust. Bringing Meredith to my home, parading her as the woman he loved, utilizing the 3 squeezes under the dinner table. It was all a grotesque stage play designed to manipulate the deepest, most vulnerable parts of my fatherly soul. I pulled through my private security gates and parked the car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. The boy I had raised was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating parasite willing to hollow out his own father for a payout. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the suffocating silence of my home. I needed to know exactly how far his rot had spread. Building a real estate empire from the dirt up requires a certain level of necessary paranoia. You do not survive the brutal, cutthroat world of commercial property acquisition by trusting people at their word. You survive by verifying absolutely everything. Years ago, alongside the standard security system visible to any guest or contractor, I had personally installed a secondary, completely covert surveillance network throughout the estate. I had micro cameras embedded in the intricate crown molding concealed within the smoke detectors and hidden seamlessly behind the facades of my bookshelves. No one knew they existed. Not my elite security detail, not my trusted cleaning staff, and certainly not Kendrick. I walked straight into my private study, bypassing the main desktop computer, and moved a heavy Persian rug to reveal a steel floor safe. I unlocked it and powered up the standalone offline server array hidden inside. The cooling fans hummed to life in the quiet room, a steady mechanical drone. The large monitor flickered on, displaying a high-definition grid of feeds covering every square inch of my property. If Kendrick and Meredith had been choreographing this hostile takeover for months, I needed to see exactly what moves they had already made inside my walls. I pulled up the encrypted archive logs and began scrubbing through the footage from the past 7 days. I watched the mundane routines of my life play out in rapid fast-forward. the housekeeper meticulously dusting the grand foyer, myself sitting in the living room reading the morning financial papers. I adjusted the search parameters to specifically flag any movement in the house during the hours I was known to be away at the corporate office or inspecting active construction sites. I watched carefully, my eyes scanning the multiple feeds for any anomaly, any breach in my sanctuary. For the first few days, there was nothing. The house remained perfectly still and secure, but my patience is limitless when it comes to protecting my territory and discovering the truth. I kept winding the digital timeline back hour by hour, day by day. I scrutinized the silent footage with the cold, detached precision of an apex predator hunting its prey. I shifted my focus to the kitchen camera, a wide-angle lens hidden flawlessly inside the digital clock on the microwave. I fast-forwarded through the weekend and into the early days of the week. My finger hovered over the pause button as a sudden flash of movement broke the static stillness of the empty kitchen. I slowed the playback to normal speed and leaned closer to the high-resolution monitor, my heart turning into a block of solid ice in my chest. The timestamp glowing in the bottom corner of the screen read Tuesday, exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I was scheduled to be across town at a lengthy zoning board meeting, a meeting Kendrick knew all about because he had specifically asked about my schedule the night before, under the guise of making dinner plans. The heavy mahogany door leading from the garage to the kitchen eased open without a sound. Kendrick stepped inside. He did not call out to see if anyone was home. He moved with a stealthy, deliberate caution, his eyes darting around the pristine room to ensure he was completely alone. He was wearing dark, nondescript clothes, a stark contrast to his usual tailored designer suits, and he kept his head angled slightly down. He walked directly to the marble island in the center of the kitchen. He did not go to the refrigerator for a drink or the pantry for a snack. He moved with chilling, undeniable purpose toward the small wooden cabinet where I kept my daily supplements and my prescription heart medication. I watched my son reach out and pull the amber plastic bottle of my beta blockers from the top shelf. He held it in his hand, examining the label closely to verify he had the right prescription. He then reached deep into the pocket of his dark jacket and pulled out a small, clear plastic vial. My breath caught in my throat. The betrayal unfolding on the screen was so intimate, so profoundly evil, it felt like a physical violation of my home. Kendrick unscrewed the child-proof cap of my medication bottle. He placed it carefully on the marble counter, making sure not to make a single sound. He uncapped the small, clear vial he had brought with him. He looked over his shoulder one last time, scanning the empty kitchen, completely unaware of the hidden lens recording his every move. I watched in absolute horror as my son carefully tapped the edge of the clear vial against the opening of my medication bottle. A fine, chalky white powder cascaded down, coating the capsules inside. It was the synthetic neurotoxin from the operational blueprint I had found in the trunk of his sports car. The chemical weapon designed to rapidly destroy my cognitive functions and perfectly mimic the symptoms of advanced dementia. He was not just waiting for my mind to fail, he was actively destroying it. Kendrick securely screwed the cap back onto my medication, gave the bottle a gentle, methodical shake to distribute the lethal powder evenly among the pills, and placed it exactly where he had found it on the shelf. He wiped the marble counter with his sleeve, turned on his heel, and slipped back out the garage door, disappearing like a thief in the daylight. I sat frozen in the cold glow of the monitor. My own flesh and blood was systematically poisoning my daily medication. He was murdering me slowly, dose by dose, with his own hands. The screen faded to black, leaving my study bathed in shadows. I did not smash the monitor. I did not scream. I methodically shut down the server and locked the safe. The son I loved was dead, and I was going to bury the man who took his place. I picked up my phone and dialed Kendrick. He answered on the second ring, his voice dripping with faux concern. I forced my tone to sound hollow, defeated, and exhausted. "Kendrick," I rasped, letting a heavy sigh escape my lips. "I have been thinking a lot about what you and Meredith said at dinner. You are right. The business, this massive house, it is all becoming too much for me. My mind is not what it used to be. Come over this Saturday for a barbecue in the backyard. Bring Meredith. It is time we sit down and talk about handing over the assets. I want you to take control of the empire." The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line was audible. The predator had just been offered the keys to the slaughterhouse. He agreed immediately, his voice trembling with manufactured gratitude. Saturday afternoon arrived thick with summer heat. The sprawling backyard of my estate was perfectly manicured, the scent of smoked hickory and roasting brisket filling the air. It looked like a picture-perfect family gathering. In reality, it was a psychological battlefield. I greeted them at the patio door, shuffling my feet slightly, rounding my shoulders to diminish my imposing stature. I was playing the role of a fading king, eager to abdicate his throne. Meredith wore a pristine white sundress, her fake smile permanently plastered to her face. Kendrick carried a bottle of bourbon, acting the part of the dutiful, supportive son. I led them to the heavy iron patio table under the shade of a massive oak tree. The table was set with fine crystal and expensive cuts of meat, a final feast before the execution they had planned. I sat down heavily, rubbing my temples as if fighting off a persistent fog. Meredith immediately launched into her sweet, patronizing routine, asking if the heat was too much for my condition. I mumbled a confused response, staring blankly at the brisket on my plate. Then came the moment of truth. I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out the amber prescription bottle, the very same bottle Kendrick had poisoned days earlier. I had, of course, emptied the toxic capsules into a hazardous waste container and replaced them with standard harmless vitamin supplements that looked identical. My hands shook violently as I unscrewed the child-proof cap. It was a calculated, Oscar-worthy performance. I fumbled with the bottle, dropping 2 pills onto the glass table before finally securing one between my trembling fingers. I lifted the glass of water to my lips, spilling a few drops down my chin, and swallowed the pill. I lowered my gaze, pretending to catch my breath, but I watched them through the reflection of the glass tabletop. Kendrick and Meredith exchanged a swift, knowing look. It was a look of pure, unadulterated victory. A sinister, arrogant smirk flashed across Meredith's face while Kendrick gave a microscopic, satisfied nod. They believed the poison was working. They believed they were watching my brain chemically dissolve right in front of their eyes. My blood boiled, but I maintained my fragile facade. I dabbed my chin with a napkin and smiled weakly at the 2 monsters sitting at my table. "I just need to stay on top of my medication," I whispered, my voice incredibly frail. "My doctor says it is very important." Kendrick reached over and patted my hand, the same hand he had squeezed under the dining table to fake a cry for help. "We are here for you, Dad," he lied flawlessly. "You do not have to worry about anything anymore." The afternoon wore on, the air thick with their arrogant complacency. They thought I was completely neutralized. It was time to strike. I stood up to pour another round of wine, my grip intentionally unsteady on the heavy crystal decanter. Meredith had placed her designer handbag and her sleek smartphone right on the edge of the table. As I leaned over to fill her glass, I feigned a sudden, violent muscle spasm. My wrist jerked and the decanter tilted sharply. A cascade of dark red wine splashed directly across the table, drenching the side of her expensive bag and completely covering her phone. Meredith gasped, jumping back from the table. "Oh my God!" she shrieked, her carefully constructed, polite persona slipping for a fraction of a second. "I am so incredibly sorry," I babbled, grabbing a handful of thick cloth napkins and rushing around the table. My hands just gave out. "Please let me clean this." I snatched her phone from the puddle of wine before she could reach it. "I will dry this off inside. It needs a microfiber cloth so the speakers do not get ruined," I insisted, not waiting for her permission. I turned and shuffled quickly into the kitchen, out of their line of sight. The moment I crossed the threshold, the shuffling old man vanished. I moved with lightning speed. I pulled a military-grade data extraction USB drive from my pocket. I wiped the wine off her screen, jammed the drive into the charging port of her phone, and pressed the activation button. The drive was designed for corporate espionage, engineered to bypass standard encryption and clone internal data packets in seconds. A small LED light on the drive blinked rapidly. I counted the seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. The light turned a solid, reassuring green. The extraction was complete. I ripped the drive out, shoved it back into my pocket, and gave the phone a final thorough wipe down with a towel. I walked back out to the patio, holding the spotless phone out to Meredith with a deeply apologetic smile. "Good as new," I said, handing the device back to her. "I cannot apologize enough for my clumsiness." Meredith snatched the phone, forcing a tight, strained smile. "It is perfectly fine, Augustus. Accidents happen." The rest of the afternoon was a blur of empty pleasantries and fake smiles. As soon as they finally drove away, I locked the doors and sprinted back to my study. I plugged the extraction drive into my offline server and ran the decryption protocol. Meredith was a professional, but she was arrogant, and arrogant people leave digital footprints. The software ripped through her encrypted messaging apps and private email folders, pulling up her direct communications with the corrupt psychiatric facility. I opened the master operational thread. The words on the screen hit me with the force of a freight train. The extraction was not a vague future plan. It was completely finalized. They had booked a private medical transport team authorizing the use of physical restraints and chemical sedation. The date of execution was stamped in bold red text at the bottom of the work order. They were coming to drag me out of my own home this coming Friday at midnight. I looked at the digital calendar on my monitor. It was Tuesday evening. I had exactly 3 days to build a trap that would completely destroy them. I did not waste a single second. As soon as I processed the terrifying reality of their Friday night extraction plan, I picked up my secure line and called Vincent. He arrived at my estate within 20 minutes, slipping quietly through the private service entrance to avoid any potential surveillance Kendrick might have arranged. We locked ourselves inside my study. The heavy mahogany doors were bolted shut, and I activated the electronic sweepers to jam any listening devices. We had exactly 72 hours before a private medical team showed up to drag me out of my own house in a chemical straitjacket. I poured us both a glass of neat bourbon and showed Vincent the decrypted operational timeline I had pulled from Meredith's phone. I watched the color completely drain from the face of a man who had spent 3 decades navigating corporate bloodbaths and vicious legal warfare. He took a slow, heavy sip of his drink and looked at me across the desk. "What is the play, Augustus?" he asked, his voice rough. "Do we call the police?" I shook my head. My jaw locked so tight my teeth ached. "If we call the police now, they will just scatter. They will hire expensive defense attorneys, drag this out in the courts for years, and claim I am a paranoid old man making up wild stories to punish my son. I do not want them to scatter, Vincent. I want them to step right into a bear trap of their own making. I want to completely obliterate them. We are going to give Kendrick exactly what he has been begging for." Vincent and I spent the rest of the night bathed in the harsh blue light of my computer monitors constructing a legal masterpiece. It was the ultimate Trojan horse. On the surface, the document we drafted was a total unconditional surrender of my entire real estate empire. It was a comprehensive transfer of assets and trust control, handing Kendrick 100% operational authority over my holding companies, my liquid cash, the estate, and all property deeds. It was structured specifically to look like the desperate, rushed act of a terrified father trying to pay off his son's imaginary loan sharks. We formatted it on the thickest, most official-looking parchment paper we could find. To a greedy, impatient predator like Kendrick, it was the Holy Grail. It was everything he and Meredith had been scheming for, neatly wrapped up and handed over on a silver platter. But Vincent is a legal genius, a man who knows exactly how to hide fatal landmines in the fine print. Buried deep within the dense bureaucratic jargon of the fiduciary compliance section, we planted a massive, irreversible poison pill. We tied the transfer of assets directly to a federal compliance and transparency waiver. The clause explicitly stated that by signing the document and accepting the role of primary beneficiary and trustee, the signatory granted immediate, unredacted, and irrevocable consent to a full financial audit by the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The language was meticulously engineered to waive all rights to financial privacy, triggering an automatic federal review of all shell companies, offshore accounts, and private ledgers linked to the trustee under the strict guidelines of anti-money laundering statutes. Kendrick was not just a greedy, treacherous son. He was a sloppy criminal. We already knew from Dr. Thorne's ledger and my own private investigations that Kendrick had been moving stolen money through a labyrinth of shady shell corporations to fund his lavish lifestyle, his luxury cars, and his secret tropical getaway. He was neck-deep in tax evasion and wire fraud. If he signed this document, he would not be inheriting a real estate empire. He would be voluntarily opening the front door of his illicit financial life and inviting the federal government to tear his house down to the studs. He would be signing his own arrest warrant. We finished the document as the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long, cold shadows across the study. Vincent reviewed the final pages, his eyes bloodshot but gleaming with a ruthless, icy satisfaction. "It is flawless, Augustus," he murmured, tapping the thick stack of paper. "If he puts his ink on that signature line, there is absolutely no legal maneuver on earth that can save him from federal prison." I waited until Thursday morning to cast the line. The tension in my chest was a tightly coiled spring ready to snap. I picked up my phone and called Kendrick. When he answered, I immediately launched into my performance. I let my breathing become rapid and shallow. I made my voice crack, sounding completely broken, erratic, and defeated by fear. "Kendrick, you need to come over here right now," I gasped, pitching my tone perfectly to mimic a man on the edge of a mental collapse. "Come alone. I have the papers. I had Vincent draft everything last night. I am giving you the entire portfolio. You can liquidate whatever you need to pay off those monsters threatening you. Just please get them off your back. I cannot lose you to those people." He was at my front door in less than 30 minutes. He rushed into the study, his face a carefully constructed mask of manufactured panic and feigned reluctance, but I could see the raw, unadulterated greed burning like a bonfire behind his eyes. He looked at the thick stack of parchment sitting on my mahogany desk as if it were a pile of solid gold bricks. "Dad, are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice trembling with fake guilt. "I hate that I brought this trouble to your doorstep. I am so sorry I failed you." I grabbed his shoulders, squeezing them hard, playing the desperate, loving father to the very last second. "I am sure, son. I am doing this to save your life. Just sign the documents. Take the power of attorney. Take the holding companies. Take everything. Just fix this mess so we can be safe." Kendrick did not need to be told twice. The mask of the reluctant, frightened son slipped instantly. He practically lunged for the solid gold fountain pen resting on the leather blotter. He did not read the fine print. He did not scan the fiduciary compliance section. He was entirely blinded by his own towering arrogance and his desperate, ravenous hunger for my wealth. I watched with a sickening mix of profound grief and ice-cold vengeance as my own flesh and blood flipped directly to the last page. He gripped the pen so tightly his knuckles turned white and aggressively scrawled his signature across the bottom line. The scratching sound of the metal nib against the paper sealed his fate forever. "It is done, Dad." Kendrick breathed out, slapping the folder shut. He could not completely hide the victorious, arrogant smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth. "I will take this to the bank right now and get those guys off our backs. Everything is going to be fine now, I promise." He grabbed the folder, gave me a quick, meaningless hug, and practically sprinted out of the study, eager to show his criminal partner the ultimate prize. I stood motionless until I heard the heavy front door slam shut and the roar of his red sports car engine fading down the driveway. The moment he was gone, the hidden door connecting my study to the private library swung open. Vincent stepped out from the shadows carrying a highly encrypted federal transmission tablet. He looked at me, raising a single eyebrow in silent question. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. Vincent tapped the screen, transmitting the digitally verified copy of the signed contract directly into the secure tip portal of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The ink on Kendrick's signature had barely dried, but as he sped down the highway, fully believing he was now the undisputed king of the city, an automated red alert was already flashing on the monitors of federal agents across the state. The audit was triggered. The trap had snapped shut violently and permanently right on his neck. The fallout from the poison pill was not a slow burn. It was an immediate, catastrophic detonation. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and the illusion of absolute victory for my son. I monitored his movements through the GPS tracker still firmly attached to his loafer. He did not go to the bank to pay off imaginary loan sharks. He drove straight to the luxury shopping district. He walked into an exclusive boutique to purchase a $50,000 platinum watch, a celebratory trophy for stealing my legacy. I could almost picture his arrogant grin as he handed over his black credit card. That grin vanished exactly 3 seconds later when the payment terminal flashed a bright red error message. Declined. Kendrick, fueled by entitled rage, handed the clerk a second card linked to his offshore shell company. Declined. He pulled out a third. Declined. He stormed out of the boutique and dialed his private wealth manager, screaming into the phone. The response he received must have felt like a physical blow. His accounts were not just overdrawn. They were completely frozen. Every single asset, domestic and international, had been locked down under a sweeping federal mandate from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The IRS and the FBI were already tearing through his financial life. I sat in the quiet comfort of my study, a cup of hot black coffee resting on my mahogany desk. The software I had covertly installed on Meredith's phone during our barbecue was functioning flawlessly. It gave me full remote access to her microphone. I pressed the key on my console to activate the live audio feed just as her phone began ringing frantically. Kendrick was calling. When she answered, he did not offer a sweet greeting. He exploded into a blind, hysterical rage. "Meredith, "What the hell did you do?" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic. "My accounts are frozen. All of them. The bank said there is a federal hold on my assets. What kind of amateur paperwork did you draft for my father?" Meredith's voice remained steady, but the underlying tension was undeniable. "Kendrick, calm down. Stop yelling on an open line. I drafted an ironclad transfer of trust. It had nothing to do with federal holds. Did you alert the bank prematurely? Did you try to move a massive sum of money this morning?" "I tried to buy a watch," Kendrick roared back, pacing furiously. "I just inherited a billion-dollar real estate empire. I should be able to buy a damn watch. But the broker said the hold was initiated by a federal compliance trigger attached to the trust document I signed yesterday. You set me up. You made a mistake, and now the feds are crawling all over my offshore accounts." I listened to the venom dripping from my son's words. There is no loyalty among thieves. The moment pressure is applied, they turn on each other like starved animals. Meredith's tone shifted from managing a partner to handling a liability. "What did you sign?" "Kendrick," she demanded, the cold professional edge cutting through his hysteria. "Tell me exactly what you signed in your father's study." "I signed the transfer of assets you gave me," he yelled. "The one with the official letterhead." He handed it to me. I signed the back page and I left. I did exactly what we planned. A heavy, damning silence fell over the line. Even through the digital feed, I could feel Meredith rapidly piecing the puzzle together. "You did not read the document before putting your signature on it?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You just blindly signed a legal contract your father handed you without having me review the final draft." He was crying, Meredith. He was terrified of the loan sharks. "I just grabbed the pen and signed it so I could get out of there." "You stupid, arrogant fool," Meredith hissed, her composure finally breaking. "Your father is not terrified. He is not losing his mind. He played you. He layered a federal audit trigger into that contract, and you just invited the IRS to rip apart every illegal shell company you have been using to hide your money." Kendrick continued to scream, demanding she fix it, threatening to drag her down with him if he went to prison. But Meredith was no longer listening to him. She was a survivalist. She recognized a sinking ship, and she had no intention of drowning with a careless, greedy amateur. "Fix this, Meredith," Kendrick shouted, his voice echoing in the background. "You promised me this was foolproof. We are supposed to be finalizing the psychiatric extraction tonight." Meredith ended the call abruptly, cutting off his frantic pleading. I listened to the ambient noise coming through her microphone. I heard the distinct sound of a closet door opening, followed by the heavy zipper of a travel bag. She was packing. She knew the federal agents were already digging into Kendrick finances, which meant they were only hours away from finding her name on the beachfront property documents and the illegal wire transfers. She needed an exit strategy, and she needed cash fast. I heard her pacing across hardwood floors, her breathing shallow and rapid. She was calculating her odds. Kendrick had nothing left to offer. His assets were frozen, and his freedom was rapidly expiring. But Meredith possessed one final valuable piece of leverage. She had documented evidence of Kendrick crimes. She had been keeping insurance. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. I knew exactly what she was going to do next. Predators like Meredith only care about one thing: self-preservation. And the only person left on the board with the power and the liquid capital to facilitate her escape was the man she had been trying to destroy. My private cell phone vibrated on the desk. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. I let it ring 3 times before picking it up. I did not say a word. I just breathed evenly into the receiver. "Mr. Wright," Meredith said, her voice completely stripped of the fake sweet condescension she had used at my dinner table. It was cold, direct, and strictly business. "We both know you are not losing your mind. You played your son beautifully. But you and I are professionals." I did not reply. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to show her hand. "Your son is a liability," she continued, her tone urgent. "He is going down, and I refuse to be collateral damage. I know you want to nail him to the wall permanently. I have something you need. I have high-definition audio recordings of Kendrick explicitly detailing his plan to poison your medication and lock you in a psychiatric ward. It is the definitive proof of premeditated attempted murder. I will hand over the original digital files and sign a sworn affidavit against him. I want $200,000 in untraceable cash, Mr. Wright. Pay me, and I give you everything you need to bury your son forever." I did not laugh, though the irony was thick enough to choke on. She wanted a massive payday from the very man she had tried to institutionalize. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of any emotion, letting her think she held the upper hand. 200,000 is a remarkably small price to pay for absolute certainty. Meredith, I replied smoothly. Bring the original digital files and the signed affidavit to the lower level of the downtown transit center parking garage. Level 4. You have exactly 1 hour. I hung up the phone before she could attempt to negotiate further. I went to my dressing room and put on a tailored charcoal suit, slipping a silver fountain pen and a highly specific specialized checkbook into my inside breast pocket. The transit center garage was a massive concrete cavern, cold, damp, and perfectly discreet for this kind of transaction. I parked my sedan under a flickering fluorescent light and waited with the engine running. Exactly 60 minutes later, the sharp, rhythmic echo of high heels rang out across the empty structure. Meredith stepped out of the shadows. She was no longer wearing the polished, modest attire of a loving, devoted girlfriend. She wore a dark, heavy trench coat, her hair pulled back tightly into a severe bun, carrying a sleek metallic hard drive in one hand and a thick leather portfolio in the other. She looked like exactly what she was, a ruthless mercenary arriving to collect her bounty. She did not bother with pleasantries or fake smiles. The manufactured sweetness was completely gone, replaced by a hardened, predatory glare. She walked right up to the hood of my car and tossed the metallic hard drive onto the metal. Everything is on there, she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, empty garage. Audio recordings of Kendrick outlining the entire neurotoxin schedule. Text logs where he ordered me to expedite the psychiatric extraction. She unzipped the leather portfolio, revealing glossy printed transcripts. I have been building this contingency file since the day he hired me, she bragged, entirely devoid of shame. He thought I was just his legal muscle, but I knew he lacked the discipline for a clean extraction. So I documented every illegal directive he gave me, every text message plotting the chemical doses. The sworn affidavit detailing his forgery of the medical power of attorney is right here. It is enough to put him away for attempted murder and elder abuse. He is entirely yours, Mr. Wright. I picked up the hard drive, feeling its cold, solid weight in my palm. You are remarkably efficient at selling out your partners, I observed mildly, looking her dead in the eyes. Meredith let out a harsh, abrasive laugh. Kendrick was never a partner, Augustus. He was an asset, a very stupid, very sloppy asset. He thought he was a criminal mastermind, but he was just a spoiled rich kid playing way out of his league. The moment he blindly signed that transfer document without letting me review the final draft, he became a massive liability. I do not go down with sinking ships, and I certainly do not go to federal prison for a man who cannot even manage a simple hostile takeover without leaving a massive audit trail. Her utter lack of loyalty was staggering but perfectly aligned with the profile of a disbarred black market attorney. She was a scavenger, eager to pick the meat off the bones of whatever carcass she could find. He trusted you, I stated simply to measure her reaction. He trusted my utility, she countered sharply. Now I am trusting yours. The money, Mr. Wright. 200,000. I need to be on a plane to a non-extradition jurisdiction by sunset. I reached into my inside pocket and withdrew my checkbook. I uncapped my silver fountain pen. You asked for untraceable cash on the phone, I said, pausing with the gold nib hovering over the paper. But a withdrawal of $200,000 in physical currency requires a 48-hour security notice at any major financial institution. You do not have 48 hours, Meredith. The FBI is already expanding the freeze on Kendrick's network. Panic flashed across her eyes for a fraction of a second. Then write me a certified cashier check from your primary holding trust, she demanded. I can cash it at the central branch immediately before the federal freeze widens. I nodded slowly, playing the part of the compliant, desperate buyer. I filled out the check, writing her name with meticulous precision, and signed the bottom. I tore the crisp piece of paper from the booklet and handed it to her. She snatched it from my fingers, examining the signature and the routing numbers with a greedy, feverish intensity. She did not even say goodbye. She turned on her heel and practically sprinted toward the stairwell, her heels clacking wildly against the concrete. She truly thought she had outsmarted everyone. I watched her disappear into the dark stairwell, a cold, satisfied smile finally breaking across my face. I got back into my car and picked up my secure phone, dialing Vincent. The transaction is complete, I told him, putting the car into gear. She took the bait without hesitation. She is heading to the central branch right now. Meredith was incredibly fast-driven by the pure, unadulterated terror of federal prison. She drove her black sedan recklessly through the downtown traffic, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. She was convinced she was the smartest person in the city. She had secured the damning evidence, extorted the billionaire, and was minutes away from a clean, wealthy getaway. She parked illegally right in front of the towering glass facade of the central bank, not caring about the immediate consequences. She just needed the liquid cash. She burst through the revolving doors, her trench coat flaring out behind her, marching directly to the high-net-worth priority teller lane. She bypassed a line of regular customers, slamming the check I had just written her onto the polished marble counter. "I need this cashed immediately," she demanded, her voice tight, breathless, and commanding. "Large bills, $100 denominations. Do not delay." The teller, a seasoned professional, looked at the astronomical sum on the check, then looked up at Meredith's frantic, sweating face. Inside the bank, the air conditioning was freezing, but a heavy bead of sweat rolled down the side of Meredith's temple. "Of course, ma'am," the teller said calmly. "Let me just run this through our priority verification system." Meredith tapped her manicured fingernails aggressively against the marble counter, constantly looking over her shoulder at the entrance. She thought she was beating the clock. She believed that because the check was drawn from an account bearing my personal signature, it was completely insulated from Kendrick's ongoing federal audit. She was severely, fatally mistaken. What Meredith did not know was that the specific checkbook I used in the parking garage was not linked to my primary secure holding trust. It was linked directly to one of the highly compromised shell companies Kendrick had aggressively attempted to absorb the day before, the exact same trust fund that Kendrick's blind signature had legally exposed to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The account was not just frozen. It was actively being monitored in real time by a joint task force of the FBI and the IRS for rampant money laundering. The teller slid the check into the digital scanner. The moment the routing number registered in the banking mainframe, a silent priority red alert triggered directly at the local federal field office. Meredith impatiently checked her gold watch. How much longer, she snapped. Before the teller could answer, the heavy glass doors of the bank flew open with a violent crash. A dozen federal agents in heavy tactical gear flooded the lobby, their badges gleaming under the bright fluorescent lights. They bypassed the security guards and marched straight toward the high-net-worth lane. Before Meredith could even process what was happening, two massive agents grabbed her arms, spinning her around and slamming her chest hard against the marble counter. The cold steel of handcuffs ratcheted tightly around her wrists right there in the crowded lobby. Meredith was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, her ambitious escape plan completely annihilated. But Kendrick had absolutely no idea. Ignorance and desperation are a volatile combination. Friday afternoon, just hours after Meredith was arrested, Kendrick burst through my front door. He looked entirely unhinged. His designer suit was wrinkled, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were bloodshot with a wild, cornered panic. His federal asset freeze had cut him off from every dime he thought he owned. He was drowning, and he needed liquid cash immediately. He grabbed me by the arm, his grip bruising and aggressive, entirely abandoning the loving son facade. "We are leaving right now," he barked, pulling me toward the door. "I have a buyer for the Westcliff mansion. They are offering $5 million in cash today, no questions asked. We are going to the notary office downtown, and you are going to sign the immediate transfer of deed." I played the frail, compliant old man, perfectly stumbling slightly as he shoved me into the passenger seat of his car. Let him think he was in control. Let him drive us straight to the execution block. The private notary office was located in a nondescript building on the edge of the commercial district. Kendrick had clearly arranged this meeting in a desperate hurry, bypassing my usual legal channels. He dragged me into a small, windowless conference room. A nervous-looking notary public placed a stack of expedited property transfer deeds on the table and quickly excused himself to make copies of our identification, leaving the two of us completely alone. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. The moment we were isolated, the last remaining shred of Kendrick's dutiful son persona disintegrated entirely. He did not bother shedding fake tears. He did not try to manipulate my emotions with stories of dangerous loan sharks or pleading for his life. He slammed his palms flat onto the table, leaning over me with a look of pure, unadulterated malice. His face was twisted into a grotesque mask of greed and rage. "Pick up the pen, old man," he commanded, his voice a venomous hiss that echoed in the small room. "Sign the papers right now." I looked up at him, maintaining my wide-eyed, confused expression. Kendrick, I do not understand, I stammered, letting my hands shake violently. Why are we selling the Westcliff property? We do not need to do this. I already gave you the holding companies. His fist slammed against the table, rattling the pen. The holding companies are locked in a bureaucratic nightmare because of your outdated legal structuring. He snarled, completely oblivious to the fact that the federal government was currently dismantling his life. I need cash today. This buyer is waiting for the deed, and I am not leaving this room until I have the wire transfer confirmation. Pick up the damn pen. I shrank back into my chair, playing the terrified victim. But what about your safety? I whimpered. What about the men threatening you? Kendrick let out a sharp, cruel laugh. It was a sound devoid of any humanity. There are no men threatening me, you senile old fool. The only threat to you in this room is me. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my face, his eyes cold and dead. I know you are losing your mind. I know you are slipping away. So let me make this incredibly simple for you. Sign the deed right now, or the special medicine I have been mixing into your daily pills is going to get a massive upgrade. You think you are confused now. Refuse to sign this, and tomorrow I will double the dose. By Sunday, you will not even remember your own name. You will be locked in a padded room drooling on yourself, and I will take everything anyway. Save yourself the misery and sign it. I looked at the heavy gold pen resting on the table. I looked at the transfer deeds that would hand over a $5 million property to this monster. Then I looked up at my son. The violent trembling in my hands vanished instantly. My slumped shoulders straightened, and I sat up to my full imposing height. The facade of the fragile, dementia-ridden old man evaporated into thin air, replaced by the ruthless, calculating predator who had built a city from the ground up. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, a slow, icy smile spread across my face. Kendrick faltered. He blinked, clearly confused by the sudden, terrifying shift in my demeanor. The predatory confidence in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden spark of uncertainty. Sign it, he repeated, though his voice lacked its previous venomous authority. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I did not pull out my reading glasses. I pulled out a thick, legally binding document bearing the official seal of the state Supreme Court. I tossed it onto the table, sliding it directly over the fraudulent transfer deeds. "What is this?" Kendrick demanded, his voice pitching higher. That I replied, my voice deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear, is a permanent federal injunction and comprehensive asset freeze. It legally prohibits the sale, transfer, or liquidation of any property under the Augustus Wright Trust. Even if I wanted to sign your pathetic little document, Kendrick, I am legally barred from doing so. You cannot sell the Westcliff mansion. You cannot access the bank accounts. You cannot buy a platinum watch. You have absolutely nothing. Kendrick stared at this court order, his face draining of all color as the catastrophic reality of his situation began to sink in. "But the medicine," he stammered, taking a step back. "I watched you take it. You took the pills. I took vitamin C supplements," I corrected him, my tone dripping with absolute disdain. "I saw you poison my bottle on the hidden kitchen cameras 3 days ago, Kendrick. I heard your recordings with Meredith. I have the files from her hard drive. I know about the fake psychiatric ward. I know about everything." Kendrick backed away from the table, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The arrogant mastermind had been completely dismantled, reduced to a terrified, cornered animal. He looked frantically toward the exit, his survival instinct finally overriding his greed. He spun around, reaching for the brass handle of the heavy wooden door. Before his fingers could even brush the metal, the door burst open with tremendous force. Kendrick stumbled backward, crashing into the conference table. My attorney, Vincent Hayes, stepped into the room. His face was set in a mask of grim, absolute satisfaction. Flanking him on either side were 2 uniformed police officers, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts. Kendrick Wright, one of the officers, announced, his voice booming with undeniable, terrifying authority. "You are under arrest for the suspected attempted murder of Augustus Wright, felony elder abuse, and massive financial fraud." The officer stepped forward, grabbing Kendrick roughly by the shoulder and forcing his arms behind his back. The cold, heavy sound of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around my son's wrists echoed loudly in the small room. Kendrick did not stay in that holding cell for long. A man fueled by sheer panic and absolute entitlement will always find a way to delay his reckoning. Because his bank accounts were entirely frozen by the federal government, he could not afford a standard bail bondsman. Instead, he made the most catastrophic decision of his life. He reached out to the very people he had previously used as a fictitious excuse to manipulate me. He contacted actual underground loan sharks. He borrowed a massive sum of unrecorded street cash at a lethal, unforgiving interest rate just to secure his temporary release pending trial. Stepping out of the precinct, he was no longer just a disgraced son facing severe federal charges. He was a dead man walking owing money to violent criminals who did not negotiate or accept apologies. The overwhelming pressure fractured whatever fragile sanity he had left. He was a cornered animal entirely stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and his impending freedom. With his back pressed firmly against the wall, his manufactured sophistication evaporated into thin air. He reverted to raw, visceral desperation, convinced that he could still salvage his stolen fortune through sheer brute force. The digital clock in my living room glowed 3 a.m. I sat in my favorite armchair, completely enveloped in the darkness of the house. The heavy, peaceful silence was suddenly shattered by the deafening sound of breaking glass. The heavy French doors leading from the patio exploded inward, raining jagged shards across the imported hardwood floor. Kendrick stepped through the ruined frame. He looked entirely deranged. His expensive tailored shirt was torn and heavily stained with sweat. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of human reason. He did not skulk in the shadows like he did when he poisoned my medication. He stomped into the room like a ruthless marauder. He grabbed a priceless antique porcelain vase from the console table and hurled it against the brick fireplace, smashing it into 1,000 pieces. I remained perfectly still in my armchair, watching the destruction with a cold, detached silence. My stillness only fueled his raging insanity. He grabbed a heavy bronze sculpture and brought it down hard on the glass coffee table, shattering the thick surface into a spiderweb of violent cracks. He turned to face me, his chest heaving, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You did this to me," he screamed, his voice echoing violently through the cavernous room. "You orchestrated this entire nightmare. You have a multi-billion-dollar empire, and you made me live like a common hired worker. You made me beg for scraps while you sat on your throne." His resentment poured out of him in a toxic, venomous flood. He marched closer, kicking aside the broken glass with his heavy shoes. "I am your flesh and blood," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "I was supposed to inherit the kingdom automatically, but you treated me like an employee. You made me earn my position. You forced me to prove my worth while other sons were handed the keys to their family estates without question. You never respected me. You never saw me as your equal. You made me hate you." He picked up a framed photograph of Loretta and hurled it across the room, the glass shattering against the far wall. "You deserve exactly what I tried to do to you," he hissed, his face now inches from mine. "You deserve to lose your mind. You deserve to rot in a padded room. You took everything from me, and now I am taking it back by force." Kendrick reached into his ruined shirt pocket and pulled out a crumpled, heavily folded document. I recognized the dense legal formatting immediately. It was a biometric asset transfer deed, an archaic but highly binding legal instrument that bypassed standard signature verification by requiring a physical thumbprint alongside a notary stamp. He also produced a small, round ink pad, his hands shaking violently with adrenaline. "The federal freeze might stop a wire transfer, but a biometric surrender of the physical estate deeds gives me immediate leverage," he growled, slamming the document onto the armrest of my chair. He pressed his thumb into the ink pad, staring at me with a lethal, psychotic intensity. "You are going to press your thumb right here," he commanded. "If you do not, I swear to God I will break your neck right now." I looked at him, my expression completely flat. "I will not give you a single dime," I said, my voice steady and unwavering. The quiet refusal snapped the last remaining thread of his restraint. Kendrick lunged forward with a primal, guttural roar. His heavy hands clamped violently around my throat, his thumbs pressing incredibly hard into my windpipe. The sheer force of his physical assault knocked my head back against the leather chair. He choked me, cutting off my air supply instantly. I grabbed his wrists, struggling just enough to register the severity of his attack. "Press your thumb on the paper," he screamed, his spittle hitting my face. "Do it!" He forced the ink pad against my right hand, trying to physically manipulate my thumb while simultaneously crushing my throat. The lack of oxygen made my vision blur around the edges, but I kept my grip firm, refusing to yield to his violent coercion. I felt the pure malice radiating from his grip. This was the ultimate betrayal, the final terrifying transformation from a greedy heir to a literal remorseless murderer. He was squeezing the life out of the man who gave him life. I dug my nails into his forearms, feeling the dark edges of consciousness closing in. Suddenly, a blinding, brilliant light flooded the entire living room. A bank of high-intensity industrial spotlights previously hidden in the recessed ceiling coves blazed to life, turning the pitch-black room into a brightly illuminated stage. Kendrick froze instantly. He recoiled, dropping the ink pad and releasing his death grip on my throat. I coughed violently, dragging fresh air into my burning lungs as I pushed his chest away. Kendrick spun around, holding a hand up to shield his eyes from the blinding glare. As his vision adjusted, the deep shadows at the far end of the room dissolved completely. Sitting in a long row of leather chairs were 12 people. Vincent Hayes sat in the center. Flanking him were 2 senior police inspectors from the Major Crimes Division, their badges reflecting the bright light. And seated perfectly still on either side of the authorities was the entire voting board of directors for the Augustus Wright Trust. The most powerful financial minds in the city had sat in absolute silence for the last hour. They had watched the broken glass fall, they had heard the vicious, hateful confession, and they had just witnessed my son attempt to strangle me to death. The 2 senior police inspectors did not hesitate. They surged forward, tackling Kendrick to the hardwood floor and wrenching his arms violently behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked into place, snapping with a sound of absolute finality. Kendrick thrashed against the floorboards, screaming curses and spewing toxic threats, but the sheer weight of the officers pinned him down. The board of directors watched the pathetic display with cold, silent contempt. I slowly stood up from my leather armchair and adjusted my collar. I did not look at the writhing man on the floor with pity, sadness, or regret. The final microscopic shred of paternal love I held for him had died the moment his hands tightened around my windpipe. I felt nothing but the icy, calculated focus of a CEO executing a hostile corporate dismantling. Kendrick was no longer my son. He was a deeply flawed liability, a cancerous growth on my legacy that required immediate surgical removal. I looked across the room and gave Vincent a single decisive nod. The legal annihilation of Kendrick Wright had officially begun. I wanted him stripped down to the molecular level. I wanted him to understand the true definition of nothingness. Kendrick, fueled by an arrogant delusion that the legal system could still be manipulated, managed to secure his temporary release by the following afternoon. He exhausted the absolute last reserves of the illicit street cash he had borrowed from the underground lenders to post an exorbitant emergency bail. He thought he could retreat to his luxury Silkwood District penthouse, regroup his thoughts, and fence his collection of high-end watches and designer artwork to fund his escape. He was catastrophically mistaken. When his cab pulled up to the towering glass and steel high-rise, he was met with a scene of total, highly organized devastation. The front circular driveway was occupied by 2 heavy-duty flatbed tow trucks. A team of mechanics was currently securing his bright red Italian sports car and his luxury black SUV to the steel ramps with heavy chains. Standing directly in front of the revolving glass doors were Vincent Hayes and a squad of uniformed county sheriffs. Kendrick sprinted up the driveway, his face twisted in a panicked rage, demanding to know what was happening. Vincent calmly stepped forward, holding a thick stack of court-validated eviction and asset seizure notices. "You do not own any of this, Kendrick," Vincent stated, his voice ringing out clearly over the roar of the tow truck engines. "This penthouse, the vehicles, the custom furniture inside, and every piece of jewelry in the wall safe are legally registered to a subsidiary holding company owned entirely by the Augustus Wright Trust. Since you attempted to murder the primary shareholder last night, your corporate privileges have been permanently revoked." Kendrick tried to push past the sheriffs to enter the building, screaming that he had personal property upstairs. The officers violently shoved him back onto the concrete pavement. A moving crew was already marching out of the lobby, carrying heavy cardboard boxes filled with his bespoke suits, his high-end electronics, and his expensive art collection. Everything was being loaded into a secure corporate transport van under the strict supervision of my security detail. The building manager approached, handing Kendrick a single cheap plastic grocery bag containing his immediate personal effects: a spare phone charger, an electric toothbrush, and a wrinkled change of clothes. The authorities ordered him to vacate the premises immediately under threat of a trespassing arrest. The elite residents of the high-rise, the very people Kendrick had spent years trying to impress, stood in the lobby and watched the humiliating spectacle with undisguised disgust. My legal team had executed a flawless surgical strike. Kendrick was left standing on the curb in the same ruined, sweat-stained shirt from the night he tried to kill me, holding a plastic bag completely stripped of his manufactured identity. He had absolutely nothing. Desperation set in rapidly as the sun began to dip below the city skyline. Kendrick wandered away from the luxury district, taking refuge on a cracked wooden bench at a busy public bus stop. He pulled out his cheap prepaid burner phone. He scrolled frantically through his contacts, calling the network of affluent associates he had spent years cultivating. He dialed his golf partners, his co-investors, and the sycophants who gladly drank his $1,000 bottles of champagne at exclusive downtown clubs. The first call went straight to voicemail. The second was rejected after a single ring. The third associate answered, but the moment Kendrick began begging for a short-term loan to secure a hotel room, the man cut him off abruptly. "Do not ever call this number again, Kendrick," the voice snapped before the line went dead. Kendrick did not understand the sheer magnitude of the power he had challenged. He thought his social capital was insulated from my reach. He was wrong. Hours earlier, I had personally made a series of brief, highly effective phone calls to the power brokers of the city. I issued a quiet but absolute commercial embargo. I made it explicitly clear that any individual firm or entity that lent Kendrick Wright a single dollar, offered him shelter, or facilitated his legal defense would be permanently blacklisted from every commercial real estate development in the state. I promised to financially ruin anyone who threw him a lifeline. The business world is built on self-preservation and profit. Facing the wrath of the city's most powerful developer, his entire network abandoned him instantly. He was a radioactive pariah. He sat on the bench shivering as the evening chill set in, finally realizing that his friends never respected him. They had only ever worshipped their proximity to my wealth. With nowhere to go and the shadows growing longer, Kendrick retreated into a gritty, poorly lit alleyway behind a commercial strip mall, hoping to find a cheap motel that accepted cash. He never made it to the street. A massive, matte black SUV pulled into the alley, its high beams blinding him and effectively blocking the only exit. The heavy doors swung open. 3 massive men stepped out onto the damp asphalt. They were not police officers. They were the ruthless underground lenders who had fronted him the bail money. Kendrick backed away, his hands raised in terror, stammering frantic promises about real estate deeds and future payouts. The lead enforcer did not say a single word. He did not care about broken trusts or frozen federal accounts. He only cared about the debt. The man stepped forward with terrifying speed, raising a solid steel pipe high into the air. He brought it down with sickening, brutal force directly onto Kendrick's left knee. The sharp, violent crack of bones snapping echoed loudly off the brick walls. Kendrick collapsed onto the garbage-strewn pavement, unleashing a guttural scream of absolute agony, completely abandoned in the dark. Kendrick did not go to a hospital. He knew the authorities and the underground lenders would be watching the emergency rooms. Dragging his shattered left leg behind him, the blinding agony burning through his veins, he crawled into the filthy bathroom of a 24-hour gas station. He slumped against the cracked, tiled wall, his face pale, sweating, and contorted with pain. But the manipulative predator inside him was not entirely dead. He had one final desperate card to play in the court of public opinion. He pulled out his cheap burner phone connected to the free public network and opened his largest social media platform. He hit the button to start a live broadcast. He purposely angled the camera to perfectly capture his bruised face, his torn clothes, and the miserable background of the gas station bathroom. He began to weep. It was a masterful performance of pure victimization. He sobbed uncontrollably into the camera, painting a horrifying picture of a tyrannical, out-of-control billionaire father who had lost his mind and violently stolen his own son's rightful assets. He claimed that my corrupt lawyer Vincent had manipulated a confused old man into illegally seizing his legitimate companies, freezing his accounts, and throwing him out onto the streets, with absolutely nothing leaving him to be beaten by hired thugs. The internet is a highly volatile, deeply reactive arena. It feeds on outrage and absolute victimhood without ever verifying the facts. Within an hour, Kendrick's tearful, pathetic live stream went completely viral. It was shared across every major platform, rapidly accumulating millions of views. To the uninformed public, the narrative was incredibly compelling. A young, successful African-American entrepreneur ruthlessly stripped of his hard-earned wealth by a greedy, vindictive billionaire father. The comments section exploded into a firestorm of digital rage directed entirely at me. Influencers and social commentators eagerly picked up the story, broadcasting my name and my corporate logo alongside words like tyrant, thief, and abuser. The public court convicted me instantly without a trial. Petitions were launched demanding immediate federal investigations into my holding companies. Angry mobs began organizing protests outside the gates of the Silkwood high-rise and the headquarters of my primary development firm. The public aggressively demanded that Kendrick's frozen assets be immediately restored and that I be investigated for financial abuse. Kendrick had managed to limp his way to a miserable cash-only motel room on the outskirts of the city, aided by a naive follower who had seen the live feed and offered him a ride. He lay on a stained mattress, his broken leg wrapped in crude homemade splints made from cardboard and duct tape. But despite the blinding physical agony, he was grinning. He watched the view count on his video skyrocket into the tens of millions. He read the thousands of hateful comments demanding my complete downfall. In his deeply fractured, arrogant mind, he believed he had finally won the war. He thought he knew exactly how a man in my position operated. He assumed that a corporate titan like Augustus Wright would be absolutely terrified of a public relations nightmare that could damage the brand. He calculated that the board of directors would panic over the plummeting stock prices and the intense media scrutiny. He fully expected my legal team to reach out before sunrise, offering a massive, multi-million-dollar financial settlement and a clean getaway just to make the viral scandal disappear. He thought public pressure would force me to quietly yield and hand him the golden parachute he so desperately craved. He thought the noise of the crowd would finally break me. Back in the quiet sanctuary of my study, the large monitors on my desk flashed with endless news alerts. Vincent stood by the window watching the live news coverage of the growing protests with a tight, angry jaw. He turned to me and asked if we should draft an immediate press release or deploy the corporate crisis management team to combat the digital defamation. I took a slow sip of my black coffee and shook my head. You do not fight a roaring fire by throwing tiny cups of water at it. You fight it by depriving it of oxygen entirely. I had no intention of engaging in a petty back-and-forth shouting match on social media with a cornered rat. I did not care about the opinions of strangers who judged a man's entire life based on a 3-minute video of fake tears. But I was not going to let my legacy be dragged through the mud by a failed assassin. I reached for my secure phone. I did not call a public relations firm. I called Robert Pierce, the executive director of the largest and most influential statewide television broadcasting network. Robert and I had done highly lucrative business together for 2 decades. I had personally financed the construction of their primary broadcast center. When he answered, he sounded frantic, apologizing profusely for the terrible coverage his network was currently airing about the protests. I cut off his apologies instantly. Robert I said, my voice projecting absolute, unshakable authority. I am not calling to complain about the news. I am calling to give you the most explosive, exclusive broadcast in the history of your network. But you have to air it unedited, uncut, and you have to put it on the air during the primetime evening broadcast at exactly 8 o'clock. I sent the encrypted high-definition video file directly to his private server. It was not a written statement. It was the unvarnished, terrifying truth. At exactly 8 o'clock that evening, regular programming across the entire state was abruptly interrupted. The lead news anchor appeared on screen, his face grave and deadly serious. He announced that the network had received verified, undisputed evidence regarding the Augustus Wright scandal. The screen cut away from the news desk. It transitioned directly to the high-definition, wide-angle surveillance footage from my kitchen. Millions of viewers sat in absolute silence in their living rooms as they watched the video. They saw the undeniable timestamp. They saw Kendrick sneaking through my back door like a thief. The camera zoomed in with terrifying clarity as Kendrick pulled the vial of synthetic neurotoxin from his dark jacket. The entire state watched him unscrew the child-proof cap of my heart medication and meticulously sprinkle the lethal white powder onto the pills intended for his own father. They saw the cold, calculated malice on his face as he shook the bottle to hide the poison. The viral sympathy for Kendrick evaporated in a fraction of a second. The digital outrage instantly and violently reversed course. The public was no longer looking at a victimized son shedding tears in a gas station bathroom. They were watching a cold-blooded, remorseless murderer caught in the act. The absolute wrath of the entire nation pivoted violently and crashed down directly onto Kendrick Wright. Meredith was sitting on a hard metal bench in a federal holding cell when her ambitious, meticulously crafted world completely collapsed. The small cage television bolted to the corner of the communal block was tuned to the evening news. She watched the high-definition surveillance footage of Kendrick sprinkling the synthetic neurotoxin into my medication bottle. The entire cell block fell silent as the broadcast played out on national television. Meredith felt the blood drain from her face. Her breathing turned shallow and frantic. The leverage she thought she held, the secret audio recording she had traded for a $200,000 check, was suddenly entirely worthless. I did not need her evidence to prove Kendrick was trying to kill me. I had him caught dead to rights on crystal-clear video. Her value as an informant evaporated in an instant. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized her throat. She knew the federal prosecutors would no longer need to offer her a generous plea deal in exchange for her cooperation. She was facing decades in a federal penitentiary for conspiracy and fraud. She scrambled to the communal phone, slamming the receiver against her ear as she demanded to speak with her court-appointed public defender. She begged him to arrange an immediate private meeting with me. She promised to hand over the names of every corrupt doctor, every shadow notary, and every offshore routing number Kendrick had ever used. She was desperate to negotiate a surrender. I agreed to the meeting, but I had absolutely no intention of negotiating. I arrived at the maximum security detention center the following morning. I walked through the stark gray corridors of the prison wearing a bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit, a crisp white shirt, and solid gold cufflinks. I was the absolute embodiment of untouchable power, a deliberate glaring contrast to the bleak, sterile environment of the facility. The guards escorted me into a small, windowless visitation room bisected by a thick wall of reinforced plexiglass. I sat down in the metal chair, resting my hands calmly on the narrow counter. A moment later, a heavy steel door opened on the other side of the glass. Meredith was escorted into the booth by a female corrections officer. The transformation was striking. The polished, arrogant predator who had sat at my dining room table offering fake smiles and quiet racism was completely gone. She wore a shapeless, bright orange prison jumpsuit. Her hair, previously styled into a sleek professional bun, hung in greasy, unkempt strands around her pale, exhausted face. The designer makeup was washed away, revealing the dark, heavy bags of a woman who had not slept a single minute. She sat down across from me, picking up the black plastic telephone receiver with trembling hands. I picked up my receiver, holding it to my ear. I did not say a word. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch between us, forcing her to speak first. Meredith swallowed hard, attempting to summon the confident corporate lawyer persona she had utilized her entire career. "Mr. Wright," she began, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "I know you have the video. I know Kendrick is finished. But you still need me. He hid millions of dollars in untraceable crypto accounts. He has a network of black market vendors who helped forge those medical documents. I know all their names. I know where the money is buried. If you talk to the district attorney and recommend a leniency agreement for me, I will give you the entire network. I will testify against him in open court. I will make sure he gets life without parole." She spoke rapidly, her desperation bleeding through every syllable. She was trying to sell out her partner to save her own skin, just as she had done in the parking garage. She thought she was sitting at a negotiating table, bartering with chips she believed still held value. I listened to her pathetic, frantic pitch with absolute clinical detachment. I did not interrupt her. I did not show anger, satisfaction, or pity. I simply let her talk until she ran out of breath and the silence returned to the small room. "You misunderstand your position, Meredith," I finally said, my voice smooth, deep, and completely devoid of mercy. "You assume you have something I want. You assume you still have a safety net to fall back on once you leave this facility." I reached inside the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a thick, legally bound portfolio. I slid the documents through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the plexiglass partition. Meredith grabbed the folder, her eyes darting frantically across the cover page. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That is the absolute destruction of your entire professional existence," I replied evenly. "I know you were disbarred 5 years ago in New York. I know you have been operating in the shadows, funneling your illicit contracts through a boutique law firm downtown. The partners there turned a blind eye to your black market operations in exchange for a heavy percentage of your hostile takeovers. You thought they would protect you. You thought they would hire a high-powered defense attorney to bail you out and keep their own names out of the federal indictments. Meredith flipped through the pages, her hands shaking so violently the paper rattled against the counter. Her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as she read the legal text. I did not just hand your name over to the authorities, I continued, leaning slightly closer to the glass. Over the weekend, I utilized a massive amount of liquid capital to execute a hostile, aggressive corporate buyout. I purchased the entire commercial building where your shadow law firm operates. I bought out their massive operational debts, and I seized total controlling interest of their firm. They do not work for you anymore, Meredith. They work for me. I immediately dissolved the partnership and surrendered every single physical and digital archive in their possession directly to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Every illegal contract you ever drafted, every bribe you ever facilitated, and every vulnerable family you ever destroyed is currently being heavily audited by federal forensic accountants. You have no hidden funds. You have no silent partners. You have absolutely zero leverage. The last remaining shred of her arrogant facade shattered completely. The realization of her total, inescapable ruin crashed over her. She dropped the portfolio, pressing her hands against the plexiglass. "Mr. Wright, please," she sobbed, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "I was just doing a job. Kendrick was the mastermind. He was the one who wanted to hurt you. I will do whatever you want. Please do not do this to me." I stood up from the metal chair, buttoning my suit jacket with slow, methodical precision. I looked down at the weeping, broken woman on the other side of the glass. "You are not just facing financial fraud and disbarment," I stated, delivering the final lethal blow with absolute ice in my veins. "You actively participated in a conspiracy to systematically poison me. I have hired a private team of the most ruthless, aggressive prosecutors on the Eastern Seaboard. I am paying them an exorbitant retainer out of my own pocket to assist the district attorney with your specific case. Their only directive is to ensure you are convicted of attempted premeditated murder. You will not get a plea deal. You will not get a reduced sentence. You will rot in a federal cage for the rest of your natural life." "No," Meredith screamed, her voice cracking as she slammed her fists frantically against the thick, bulletproof glass. "No, come back here. We can make a deal. I can help you. Please." I turned my back on her and walked toward the exit of the visitation room. I did not pause. I did not look over my shoulder. I walked out into the corridor, the heavy steel door slamming shut behind me with a resounding, permanent echo completely silencing the desperate, pathetic wailing of the woman who thought she could steal my crown. Kendrick was a ghost of a man. The pristine, custom-tailored suits he used to parade around the city were completely gone, replaced by filthy, blood-stained rags. His left leg violently shattered by the underground enforcers dragged behind him like a dead, agonizing weight. Every step he took was a masterclass in physical torment. He had absolutely no money, no powerful allies, and no future. The federal authorities were hunting him relentlessly. The street lenders wanted him dead, and the general public despised him as a viral monster. With his mind entirely fractured by intense physical pain and absolute financial ruin, his focus narrowed into a single pathetic desire for vengeance. He did not attempt to breach the towering corporate skyscrapers or my heavily guarded luxury estates. He knew he would never make it past the front gates. Instead, he dragged himself through the shadows to the dusty industrial outskirts of the city, arriving at a crumbling, rusted cinder block building. It was the old mechanic shop where I had started my business 40 years ago. It was the absolute birthplace of the Augustus Wright Empire. For Kendrick, it was a glaring symbol of the gritty working-class roots he had always been deeply ashamed of. If he could not inherit my pristine billion-dollar kingdom, he was determined to burn its genesis to ashes. He broke the rusted padlock on the side door with a heavy stone, stumbling blindly into the dark, oil-stained garage. He carried a heavy red plastic jerry can filled with stolen gasoline. He uncapped it, the pungent chemical fumes instantly filling the stagnant air, and began to wildly splash the fuel across the ancient workbenches, the cracked concrete floor, and the heavy structural wooden pillars that held up the roof. He tossed the empty plastic can aside, the hollow clatter echoing loudly in the cavernous space. He reached into his pocket with trembling, filthy fingers and pulled out a cheap plastic lighter. Before his thumb could strike the flint, a voice cut cleanly through the heavy, toxic darkness. "You always hated this place," I said, my voice perfectly calm, resonating off the concrete walls. Kendrick screamed, spinning around so fast he lost his balance and crashed hard onto his ruined leg. He groaned in absolute agony, clutching his shattered knee as he looked up. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the back office. I wore a flawless, tailored charcoal suit, completely unbothered by the dust and the suffocating fumes of the gasoline. You hated the smell of the motor oil. I continued walking slowly and deliberately toward him. You hated the dirt on the floor. You thought this garage was entirely beneath you. But the grease in this building is the only reason you ever got to wear Italian silk and drive European sports cars. Kendrick bared his teeth, his face twisting into a mask of feral, unhinged hatred. You owe me. He spat, his voice hoarse, broken, and dripping with venom. You built an empire, and you hoarded the power for yourself. You made me jump through hoops. You made me feel like nothing. Everything I did, the forgery, the medicine I did, because you pushed me to it. I looked down at the miserable, broken creature writhing on the floor. I gave you the entire world, Kendrick. I gave you the finest education, infinite operational capital, and a safety net most men would kill to have. But I also tried to teach you the value of sweat. I tried to teach you that real power is not inherited. It is built, day by day, brick by brick. But you were too weak to build. You only knew how to take. Kendrick struggled to push himself up against a gasoline-soaked wooden pillar, gripping the lighter tightly in his fist. You never loved me, he sneered, tears of desperate rage cutting tracks through the heavy dirt on his face. You loved your legacy more than your own son. You wanted me to fail so you could look down on me. I shook my head, feeling the final absolute death of my fatherly grief. I wanted you to be a man. Instead, you chose to be a parasite. You hired a criminal to steal my assets. You forged medical documents to lock me in a cage. You poisoned my medication with your own hands. Do not blame my legacy for the darkness in your own soul, Kendrick. You made those choices with a clear mind. And now I am making this choice, he screamed, holding the lighter high in the air. I am going to burn your precious history to the ground and watch you lose everything. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my silver pocket watch, checking the time with clinical, unwavering detachment. You are incredibly predictable, Kendrick. When a parasite runs out of hosts to feed on it, turns to blind destruction. The faint, distant wail of police sirens began to echo through the cold night air. The sound grew rapidly, multiplying and converging from multiple directions. Brilliant red and blue lights began to flash frantically against the grimy, frosted windows of the old garage. Kendrick froze his eyes, darting toward the street, raw panic instantly replacing his violent bravado. "What did you do?" He panicked, his voice dropping to a terrified, breathless whisper. "I have had a private security detail tracking you since the moment you left that gas station bathroom," I explained smoothly, securing the watch back in my pocket. "I knew exactly where you were hiding. I knew exactly when you stole the gasoline. And I knew exactly where you were heading tonight. I called the police major crimes division 30 minutes ago. I told them the federal fugitive they were hunting was currently attempting to commit felony arson at this exact address." The sirens were deafening now. The violent screech of tires and the heavy slamming of car doors erupted right outside the garage doors. "This was my very first piece of property, Kendrick," I said, my voice slicing effortlessly through the chaotic noise outside. "It represents everything I survived to build my family. It is the one thing I will never let you destroy." In his frantic, terrified state, Kendrick lost control of his hands. His fingers trembled violently and his thumbs slipped heavily against the plastic wheel of the lighter. A single bright spark jumped from the flint, catching a small pool of gasoline near the base of the wooden pillar. A bright, aggressive flame erupted instantly, casting a sinister orange glow across his terrified, pale face. The fire began to crawl rapidly along the concrete floor, feeding on the fuel he had spilled. Realizing the absolute, inescapable finality of his situation, the last remaining shred of Kendrick's ego completely shattered into dust. He collapsed forward onto his hands and knees, entirely ignoring the blistering agony radiating from his shattered leg. He dragged himself across the dirty, burning floor through the rising black smoke. He reached out and wrapped his arms tightly around my legs. "Dad, please," he wailed, a primal, pathetic sound tearing from his throat. He looked up at me, his face streaked with dirt, tears, and absolute terror. He grabbed my right hand with both of his filthy palms, holding on as if I were his only lifeline in the world. He looked directly into my eyes and he squeezed my hand hard. 1, 2, 3. The thick, acrid smoke from the burning gasoline began to billow rapidly toward the rusted corrugated metal ceiling, choking the stagnant air inside the old mechanic shop. The small, aggressive flames licked hungrily at the base of the wooden pillar, casting erratic, dancing shadows across the cracked concrete floor. Outside, the deafening wail of police sirens and the chaotic shouting of tactical officers preparing to breach the perimeter created a wall of terrifying sound. But inside the garage, the world seemed to shrink down to the pathetic, broken figure groveling at my feet. Kendrick was hyperventilating, choking on the toxic fumes and his own desperate sobs. He clung to my right hand with a frantic, white-knuckled grip, treating me as his absolute last refuge against the severe consequences closing in around him. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely stripped of his usual manufactured arrogance. Then, relying on the ultimate emotional manipulation, he pressed his filthy palms against mine. He squeezed my hand hard. 1, 2, 3. Dad. He choked out, coughing violently as the black smoke swirled around us. Dad, save me, please. You have to save me. I stood perfectly still amidst the growing inferno and looked down at the man kneeling in the dirt. I waited for the familiar, agonizing pang of paternal grief to strike my chest. I waited for the biological imperative that compels a father to throw himself into the fire to shield his offspring from harm. But as I stared into Kendrick's tear-streaked, soot-covered face, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no rush of adrenaline, no desperate urge to protect, and not a single tear formed in my eyes. The vast, infinite reservoir of unconditional love I had held for him my entire life had run completely dry. The 3 squeezes, the sacred code Loretta and I had created to keep him safe from the cruelties of the world, registered as nothing more than a hollow, cynical tactic. In my mind, a fleeting image of Kendrick as a 10-year-old boy at that crowded summer festival flashed brightly. I remembered the innocent, terrified child who had genuinely needed his father to stand between him and the vicious bullies. I remembered the fierce, unwavering vow I had made to protect him at all costs. But as the orange flames reflected in Kendrick's bloodshot eyes, that innocent boy vanished forever, consumed by the reality of the predator clutching my hand. The person sobbing at my feet was not a scared child in need of rescue. He was a ruthless, calculating adult who had systematically orchestrated my complete destruction. He was the man who had sought out a black market attorney, forged medical documents, and attempted to legally strip away my sanity. He was the man who had sneaked into my kitchen like a coward and methodically sprinkled a synthetic neurotoxin into my heart medication, fully intending to watch me deteriorate into a drooling, mindless ghost. He did not want my protection. He wanted a convenient shield to hide behind now that his own malicious plans had spectacularly imploded. The stark, undeniable truth crystallized in my mind with absolute clarity. My son had not been corrupted by bad influences or tragic circumstances. He had been corrupted by his own insatiable, bottomless greed. I had built a massive dynasty to ensure he would never know the sting of poverty, but the unlimited wealth had only magnified the profound darkness inherent in his character. The tears rolling down his face were not tears of genuine remorse for the horrific crimes he had committed against his own blood. They were the pathetic, selfish tears of a criminal who had finally been outsmarted and was terrified of the impending punishment. He was crying for himself, mourning the loss of the luxury and power he had so violently tried to steal. The cherished memory of my son was officially dead, replaced entirely by the unvarnished reality of my attempted murderer. My gaze hardened into a mask of pure glacial ice, completely unaffected by the searing heat of the flames spreading across the garage floor. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I did not bend down to pull him from the debris. Moving with a slow, deliberate, and chilling precision, I raised my left hand and clamped it firmly over Kendrick's filthy, trembling wrists. I dug my thumb deeply into the nerve cluster just below his palm, forcing his desperate grip to loosen. He gasped in pain, but I did not stop. With absolute mechanical detachment, I began to pry his fingers off my right hand one by one. It was a highly symbolic physical manifestation of my permanent withdrawal from his life. Kendrick felt the uncompromising finality in my movements, and his panic escalated into sheer animalistic terror. "No, Dad, please do not do this," he wailed, struggling feebly against my grip as another wave of black smoke rolled over us. "You cannot let them take me. I am your son. I am your blood. You have to forgive me. You have to fix this." I peeled his index finger back, then his middle finger, feeling the heavy grime and cold sweat coating his skin. I did not break eye contact as I systematically dismantled his desperate hold on me. The physical separation was absolute and irreversible. He tried to scramble closer, attempting to grab the fabric of my tailored trousers to anchor himself, but I took a firm, decisive step backward, leaving him completely unsupported on the dirty concrete. He slumped forward, his face hovering inches from the growing puddle of burning gasoline, completely shattered by the realization that his ultimate psychological weapon had utterly failed. The emotional manipulation that had effortlessly carried him through his entire privileged life was now entirely useless. The invincible fortress of his father love had permanently locked its heavy iron gates, and he was left shivering on the outside, completely exposed to the consequences of his own treachery. I stood tall above him, the thick black smoke swirling aggressively around the lapels of my suit. The heavy metal roll-up doors of the garage began to rattle violently as the tactical units outside applied a hydraulic battering ram to the rusted hinges. I looked down at Kendrick for the very last time, observing the miserable wreckage of the man who thought he could steal my kingdom. That signal was designed for a child with a good, honest heart, I said, my voice cutting through the roar of the fire and the screaming sirens with lethal, unforgiving clarity. You killed that child yourself. I turned my back on him. I did not look back as the heavy steel doors finally gave way, exploding inward with a deafening crash. A dozen heavily armed police officers flooded into the smoke-filled garage, their tactical flashlights piercing the darkness. I calmly walked toward the side exit, stepping smoothly into the cool, quiet night air as the officers swarmed the center of the room. They aggressively tackled the wailing, broken man to the concrete floor, pinning him down and securing the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The muffled, pathetic sound of my former son screaming my name faded into the distance as I walked away into the night. The federal courthouse was a massive structure of polished marble and cold steel. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick, heavy, and suffocatingly silent. The gallery was packed to absolute capacity with reporters, former business associates, and curious onlookers eager to witness the final destruction of the Wright family legacy. The heavy mahogany double doors remained closed, sealing us all inside this theater of absolute judgment. I sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Vincent and my core executive team. I wore a dark, immaculate suit, my posture perfectly straight, betraying absolutely no emotion. Across the aisle, sitting at the defense table, were the two architects of their own demise. Meredith Vance looked completely hollowed out, her once pristine posture replaced by a nervous, twitching wreck wrapped in a drab prison uniform. Beside her sat Kendrick. He was confined to a wheelchair due to his shattered leg, his face pale, gaunt, and completely stripped of his former arrogance. The heavy, oppressive silence was broken only by the sharp, authoritative crack of the bailiff calling the room to order. The judge entered his black robes, billowing, and took his seat high above us. The trial of Kendrick Wright and Meredith Vance had officially begun. When the prosecution called my name, I stood up and walked toward the witness stand with slow, measured steps. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, my voice resonating with deep, unwavering authority. I sat down and looked directly at the jury box. I did not offer the tragic performance of a broken, grieving father. I delivered the cold, clinical testimony of a chief executive officer methodically detailing a hostile corporate sabotage. The lead prosecutor guided me through the timeline of the ultimate betrayal. I answered every question with absolute precision. I did not let my voice waver a single time. I described the dinner party where my son utilized a sacred childhood signal to falsely cry for help while his partner remotely drained $50,000 from my emergency accounts. The jury listened in horrified silence as I recounted the late-night phone call exposing the fabricated story of the violent loan sharks designed to extort my most valuable commercial properties. I detailed my discovery of the medical blueprint hidden in the trunk of Kendrick's sports car. I calmly explained how I uncovered the fake psychiatric evaluation purchased from a corrupt physician, a document specifically engineered to strip away my fundamental human rights and lock me inside a padded room. Then the prosecutor projected the high-definition surveillance footage onto the massive screens in the courtroom. I watched the faces of the jurors contort with visceral disgust as the video showed Kendrick sneaking into my kitchen. My voice remained entirely flat and detached as I narrated his actions. I identified the amber prescription bottle. I identified the synthetic neurotoxin. I pointed directly at the man in the wheelchair and testified that he had systematically poisoned my daily medication with the explicit intent of destroying my cognitive function. I did not look away from him as I spoke. Kendrick kept his eyes glued to the defense table, physically shrinking under the crushing weight of his exposed crimes. Next came the audio files. The courtroom echoed with the venomous recordings Meredith had so arrogantly compiled. The jury heard Kendrick impatiently ordering the acceleration of the psychiatric extraction. They heard the raw, undisputed malice in his own voice. Every piece of evidence I presented was a nail driven deep into his coffin. The defense attorneys attempted to cross-examine me, trying desperately to frame me as a domineering, controlling patriarch who had driven his son to temporary insanity. I dismantled their arguments with ruthless surgical logic. I stated unequivocally that my wealth was earned through decades of relentless labor and no amount of perceived grievance justified premeditated, attempted murder. My testimony was absolute bulletproof and utterly devastating. The jury did not need long to deliberate. They returned to the courtroom in less than 4 hours, their faces set in expressions of unified, grim resolve. The foreperson stood up and handed the sealed envelope to the bailiff. The judge unfolded the paper and read the verdict aloud. Guilty on all counts. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of felony elder abuse. Guilty of massive wire fraud and forgery. Meredith collapsed forward onto the defense table, burying her face in her hands as her shoulders shook with violent, silent sobs. Kendrick simply stared straight ahead, his eyes completely hollow, the terrifying reality of his ruined life finally crashing down upon him. The judge did not delay the inevitable. He proceeded directly to the sentencing phase. He looked down at the defense table with an expression of profound, unadulterated disgust. Kendrick Wright, the judge, declared, his voice booming with judicial fury. You were granted every privilege and advantage this society has to offer. Instead of building upon that legacy, you chose to orchestrate the cruel, systematic destruction of the father who provided it to you. Your actions display a level of calculated malice that demands the absolute maximum penalty. The judge raised his wooden gavel high into the air. I sentence you to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down onto the sounding block with a violent echoing crack that sealed Kendrick's fate forever. The judge then turned his fierce gaze toward the weeping woman. Meredith Vance, you weaponized your legal expertise to facilitate the attempted murder of an innocent man. I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison. The gavel slammed down a second time, finalizing the destruction of their illicit alliance. 2 heavily armed federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Meredith by the arms and hauling her out of the courtroom through the side door. 2 more marshals approached Kendrick. They locked the brakes on his wheelchair and secured his wrists to the heavy metal armrests with thick leather restraints. As they began to wheel him away toward the holding cells, the absolute finality of his situation completely broke his mind. The shock wore off, replaced by a sudden primal panic. He twisted violently in the chair, ignoring the agony in his shattered leg. He looked wildly across the courtroom aisle, his desperate eyes locking onto me. Daddy screamed, his voice tearing through the silent courtroom, ragged and completely saturated with terror. Dad, please. I am sorry. Do not let them take me. Dad. The heavy steel doors swung open and the marshals pushed his wheelchair into the dark corridor. His pathetic, desperate wailing echoed through the hall, bouncing off the marble walls until the doors slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud. I remained sitting in the front row. I did not blink. I did not turn my head. I sat perfectly still in my tailored suit, immovable and silent as a statue carved from solid black stone. I returned to my expansive estate just as the evening sun began to cast long golden shadows across the pristine manicured lawns. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside a profound, absolute stillness. The sprawling mansion was entirely quiet, but for the first time in my life, it did not feel lonely or hollow. It felt completely sanitized. I walked purposefully through the grand foyer and directly into the main living quarters. I did not pour a drink or sit down to rest in my armchair. I began a methodical, ruthless eradication of my past. I moved from room to room, gathering every framed photograph, every childhood sports trophy, and every single lingering artifact that bore Kendrick's face or name. I pulled down the heavy silver frames from the mantelpiece. I emptied the thick leather photo albums stored in the library. I tossed every university diploma and every piece of expensive personalized memorabilia into heavy black industrial trash bags. The biological tie between us was already dead severed the moment he placed his hands around my throat in a desperate bid for my wealth. Now I was executing the physical erasure. I dragged the heavy bags out to the industrial incinerator behind the estate staff quarters. I tossed them inside the metal drum, struck a long wooden match, and watched the physical evidence of my failed lineage catch fire. I felt no grief as the thick black smoke rose into the twilight sky. I felt only a clean, sterile finality. The following morning, I sat at the head of the massive mahogany table in the center of my executive boardroom. Vincent Hayes sat directly across from me, his briefcase open, meticulously arranging a towering stack of highly complex legal documents. He looked up, his expression a mixture of profound professional respect and deep personal understanding. We had weathered the ultimate devastating storm, and now it was time to permanently reconstruct the architecture of my legacy. We are completely liquidating the existing familial trust structures, I instructed, my voice cutting cleanly through the quiet room. Every single holding company, every commercial property deed, and every offshore account is to be immediately consolidated and restructured into a new entity. Vincent nodded, his silver pen hovering over the fresh legal parchment. And the primary beneficiary, he asked, seeking the final official confirmation for the record. There are no beneficiaries, I stated firmly, locking eyes with him. I am permanently divesting my bloodline from my wealth. Not a single cent, not a single square foot of property will ever be inherited by anyone simply because they share my last name. Instead, we are establishing a completely new foundation, the Loretta Wright Foundation. I watched Vincent draft the initial articles of incorporation as I laid out the uncompromising, aggressive parameters of the new trust. My entire multi-billion-dollar empire was to be irrevocably transferred into an endowment entirely dedicated to the empowerment of underprivileged African-American youth. We were not going to hand out blind charity or fund entitled unearned lifestyles. The foundation would aggressively seek out young men and women from the exact same gritty, unforgiving neighborhoods where Loretta and I had started our journey. We would find the ones with calloused hands, sharp minds, and the relentless, undeniable hunger to build something from absolutely nothing. We would provide full-ride university scholarships, massive zero-interest commercial loans for minority-owned startups, and elite corporate mentorship programs designed to bypass the traditional gatekeepers of wealth. We will build an army of young titans who understand the true value of sweat, loyalty, and sacrifice. I told Vincent, signing my name with bold, aggressive strokes on the primary authorization forms. I will not leave my kingdom to a pathetic parasite who thought he could steal it. I will leave it to 1,000 hungry lions who are willing to fight for it and respect it. Vincent gathered the signed documents, securing them inside his briefcase with a heavy, satisfying click. "It is a bulletproof structure, Augustus," he assured me. "Your legacy is completely secured, and your empire will fund generations of real earned success." I left the corporate headquarters later that evening, taking my private secured elevator directly to the top floor of the Silkwood high-rise. I stepped out into the sprawling, multi-million-dollar penthouse that I had violently reclaimed from Kendrick just weeks prior during his eviction. The corporate moving crews had completely stripped the massive space of his extravagant, tasteless modern art and gaudy designer furniture, returning the penthouse to a state of pristine, minimalist perfection. I walked across the imported hardwood floors, the sound of my dress shoes echoing in the vast emptiness, and pushed open the massive floor-to-ceiling glass doors leading out to the wraparound terrace. I stepped into the cool, rushing night air. The city stretched out infinitely below me, a vast, glowing ocean of light concrete and steel. I reached into my tailored jacket pocket, pulled out a premium hand-rolled Cuban cigar, and snipped the end with a solid gold cutter. I sparked a wooden match, letting the bright flame catch the tobacco, and took a slow, deep drag. The rich, heavy smoke filled my lungs as I leaned my forearms against the thick, reinforced glass railing. I looked down at the bustling commercial districts, the towering residential blocks, and the distant, gritty industrial zones where I had first learned how to survive and fight. I owned a massive fraction of the brilliant skyline reflecting in my eyes. I had bought it, built it, and violently defended it from the very forces I had invited into my own home. The air up here was thin, cold, and entirely isolated, but it was also incredibly clear and peaceful. I blew a thick cloud of smoke out into the night, watching it quickly dissipate into the powerful wind. I was 69 years old. I had absolutely no family left. I had no heir to sit beside me at the dinner table. But looking down at the unbreakable empire I had forged with my own two hands, I realized I had never been more powerful or more free. The world often operates under a dangerous, deeply flawed assumption. They look at aging parents and see nothing but fragility and declining mental acuity. They think paternal love is a blinding vulnerability, a fatal weakness inherent to old age that can be easily exploited for a quick, devastating payout. They assume the fierce, calculating predators who built the very foundations of their comfortable lives somehow vanish the moment their hair turns gray. But they forget the fundamental, terrifying truth of how empires are actually forged. A man who can claw his way out of the absolute bottom of the mud, who can build a towering kingdom of immense wealth and power in absolute silence, never truly loses his edge. He simply learns how to hide his weapons behind a polite smile. And if provoked, he can use that exact same chilling silence to systematically dismantle, destroy, and permanently bury anyone who dares to reach for his crown. There is another crucial lesson buried in the ashes of this betrayal. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, and shared DNA is never a substitute for true character. For too long, society conditions us to believe that we owe our children an endless safety net regardless of their actions. But entitlement is a poison that destroys the soul. When you blindly fund a lifestyle a person did not earn, you do not protect them from the world. You simply turn them into predators. Severing those toxic ties is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation and the only way to ensure your life work serves a higher purpose. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of justice and survival.